Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
The story of Operation Morris Dance. It was May 14, 1987, when the first echoes of unrest reached the shores of the Pacific. In the early morning hours, the tranquil island nation of Fiji woke to the grip of uncertainty. The Republic of Fiji Military Forces, RFMF, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sitiveni Rabuka, had executed a bloodless coup, dismantling the elected government and seizing control of the state. The once peaceful streets of Suva and Lautoka were now tense, as whispers of turmoil spread like wildfire through villages and cities alike. Far across the ocean, in Canberra, Australia's Defence Ministry sat on edge. The coup had shaken more than Fiji's political foundations. It reverberated through the hearts of nearly 5,000 Australian nationals living in the islands. Diplomatic tensions surged as Prime Minister Bob Hawke convened emergency sessions. The Australian Defence Force, ADF, was tasked with a monumental decision: to intervene in Fiji's unrest, or to stand as silent witnesses to the rise of a military regime. In the days that followed, naval ships and air squadrons quietly readied themselves. Plans were drawn, communications encrypted, and a name was whispered within corridors of military command: Operation Morris Dance. The mission was clear: evacuate Australians should the situation spiral beyond control. Yet, with the coup's architects still firmly in power and global eyes fixated on the Pacific, every move was fraught with risk. The tropical breeze over Fiji's waters carried more than the scent of the ocean; it carried the weight of nations preparing for an uncertain future. Fiji, a land of sunlit beaches and coral reefs, had always been a beacon of serenity in the Pacific. Its cultural fabric was a delicate weave of indigenous Fijian traditions, Indian diaspora heritage, and colonial influences. Yet, beneath the surface of this picturesque nation lay long-standing tensions between ethnic groups and power structures that simmered through decades of independence. By the 1980s, political fractures had deepened. The Fijian Labour Party, led by Timosai Bavadra, had challenged the established order, advocating for policies of inclusion. In April 1987, his coalition swept into power. For some, it was a victory for democracy. For others, it was a threat to the traditional chiefly hierarchy and the dominance of ethnic Fijians in governance. On the morning of May 14th, the precarious peace shattered. 10 soldiers under Rabuka's command marched into parliament. Without a single shot fired, the government was overthrown. Radio announcements proclaimed a new order. For citizens and expatriates alike, fear and confusion replaced routine. What would follow in the coming days remained unknown. Meanwhile, in Australian consulates, staff scrambled to contact nationals scattered across Fiji. The phones rang endlessly, each call bringing news of stranded families or those too afraid to leave their homes. The clock had begun ticking, and each hour brought the ADF closer to action. The shock of the coup rippled through Canberra as intelligence reports painted an unstable picture of the situation in Fiji. Prime Minister Bob Hawke convened an emergency cabinet meeting, where military and diplomatic leaders gathered to assess their options. The safety of Australian citizens became the focal point of deliberations. Australia's immediate response was measured. The government quickly condemned the coup but refrained from interfering in Fiji's internal politics. Behind closed doors, contingency plans were quietly activated. The Australian Defence Force, ADF, prepared for an evacuation operation, should the coup escalate into violence or civil unrest. Codenamed Operation Morris Dance, the plan aimed to deploy naval and air assets to safely extract Australian nationals. Naval ships in the region, including HMAS Stalwart, Sydney, and Tobruk, were placed on high alert. Meanwhile, the Army's operational deployment force, centered around the 3rd Brigade in Townsville, prepared to move. Despite these measures, the Australian government faced a delicate balancing act. Any overt display of military strength could be perceived as an intervention, potentially inflaming tensions further. As the ships moved closer to Fiji's territorial waters, the officers on board prepared for a mission fraught with uncertainty. For many sailors, this was no ordinary exercise, it was a potential call to action in a volatile and unpredictable environment. In the days following the coup, Fiji was a nation on edge. Suva's streets bore the marks of sudden political upheaval. Banks closed their doors, markets grew eerily quiet, and whispers of fear echoed in the capital. Rabuka's junta had declared martial law, promising order, but the atmosphere was anything but stable. Expatriates, including Australians, found themselves caught in a web of uncertainty. Some sought refuge in embassies, while others contemplated leaving their homes for the safety of the countryside. For many, the idea of evacuation was both a relief and a gamble. Would foreign governments step in before the unrest spiraled further? In Australia, news of the coup dominated headlines. Families of those in Fiji flooded consular lines, pleading for updates. As the pressure mounted, the ADF's leadership finalized their plans. Rear Admiral Peter Sinclair took command of the Naval Task Force, while ground units began assembling their equipment. The operation would be swift and decisive, relying on precise coordination between the Navy, Air Force, and diplomatic staff on the ground. While the ADF prepared, political leaders weighed the broader implications of intervention. Australia's history in the Pacific was fraught with colonial undertones, and any misstep could damage its relations in the region. With every decision, the stakes grew higher. The waters off Fiji grew crowded as Australian warships arrived near the islands. HMAS Sydney and Adelaide docked in Lautoka and Suva, while Stalwart patrolled the northern reaches. In addition, Parramatta and Wollongong joined the fleet, forming a formidable presence. Their mission was clear: establish a secure communication line with the Australian High Commission in Suva and stand ready for an evacuation. Yet, the sight of warships in Fijian waters raised eyebrows. Locals wondered if Australia intended to use its military might to restore the overthrown government. On board, sailors prepared for a potential humanitarian mission. Landing craft were inspected, medical supplies checked, and evacuation drills rehearsed. The mood was tense but determined. For many of these sailors, this was their first deployment in a high-stakes scenario. They were no longer training for abstract threats, they were preparing for a real operation in a politically charged environment. The Fijian authorities, wary of Australia's intentions, ordered the ships to leave. On May 20th, the vessels pulled back, cruising just outside Fiji's territorial waters. For the ADF, this was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. The ships remained close enough to respond if the situation deteriorated, a silent reminder of Australia's readiness to act. By late May, the atmosphere in Fiji grew increasingly volatile. Reports of riots, looting, and sporadic acts of violence trickled back to Canberra. The Republic of Fiji Military Forces, RFMF, now firmly under Rabuka's command, struggled to maintain control. Tensions between ethnic Fijians and the Indo-Fijian community, already fragile, threatened to erupt into widespread unrest. The Australian High Commission in Suva found itself at the center of escalating fears. Each day, staff answered calls from Australians seeking guidance. Families with children, retirees, and business owners all weighed their options. Should they stay and wait for stability, or attempt to leave before the unrest worsened? The embassy, though resourceful, lacked the means to evacuate large numbers of people without military assistance. Back in Australia, media coverage of the coup and its aftermath kept the public on edge. Prime Minister Hawke faced mounting pressure to act decisively. The ADF was ordered to finalize detailed evacuation plans. Time was of the essence, and every delay increased the risks to Australian nationals trapped in Fiji's chaos. The ships patrolling Fiji's waters conducted surveillance while awaiting further instructions. Despite their retreat from territorial waters, their presence was a reassurance to those in need of evacuation. The sailors on board remained vigilant, knowing they could be called into action at any moment. On May 23, the Australian government gave the green light for Operation Morris Dance to formally commence. The mission's scope was clear: evacuate Australian citizens swiftly and safely if conditions deteriorated further. A dedicated team of planners worked around the clock, coordinating with the Naval Task Force, ground troops, and diplomatic staff. The ADF dispatched additional forces to strengthen the operation. B Company of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 1RAR, was flown from Townsville to Norfolk Island. From there, helicopters ferried the soldiers to ships already stationed near Fiji. These troops were tasked with providing security and assisting in evacuation efforts if the situation called for it. Meanwhile, HMAS Tobruk, a heavy-lift ship equipped for amphibious operations, became the centerpiece of evacuation plans. Its capacity to transport large numbers of people and vehicles made it indispensable. Other vessels, including HMAS Success, were fitted with additional supplies to support evacuees during the operation. The mission's complexity required precision and patience. Evacuation routes were mapped, contingency plans drafted, and diplomatic channels kept open. The task force would need to act decisively while navigating the political sensitivities of operating in another nation's sovereign territory. As Australia's military preparations intensified, so did the scrutiny from regional neighbours and the international community. New Zealand, too, had placed its forces on alert, ready to evacuate its own citizens. The United States and Japan quietly requested assistance in case their nationals required evacuation. Fiji's new government grew increasingly suspicious of the activity surrounding its borders. Rabuka and his advisors feared that foreign powers might intervene militarily under the guise of humanitarian assistance. The junta issued public statements warning against interference, escalating diplomatic tensions further. The ADF faced the challenge of balancing readiness with restraint. The operation was strictly non-combatant, yet every movement of ships and troops was under watchful eyes. Any misstep could be interpreted as an invasion, further destabilizing the region. For the sailors and soldiers involved, the uncertainty weighed heavily. They trained rigorously each day, rehearsing evacuation scenarios and preparing for a range of outcomes. But in quiet moments, they wondered whether the mission would go forward or if they'd return home without firing a shot. The waiting game tested their resolve. By May 25, the task force was at peak readiness. Ships maintained a constant presence near Fiji's waters, while the troops on board stayed in high alert. Communication lines buzzed with updates from Suva and Canberra, where diplomats monitored the unfolding crisis closely. For those on the ground in Fiji, life had taken on a surreal quality. Australian expatriates went about their daily lives with a mix of caution and denial. Markets opened sporadically, schools remained shuttered, and streets emptied by nightfall. Rumors of more unrest spread rapidly, further unsettling the population. In the distance, the faint silhouettes of Australian warships loomed over the horizon. For some, they were a beacon of hope, a reminder that help was near. For others, They were a stark symbol of external pressure, an unsettling presence that complicated Fiji's delicate political landscape. As the month drew to a close, the ADF received reports that the situation in Fiji was beginning to stabilize. Rabuka's regime consolidated power, and the immediate threat of violence subsided. However, the possibility of a sudden escalation kept Operation Morris Dance active. The sailors and soldiers waited, ready to spring into action if the call came. As May 1987 waned, the Australian government balanced a precarious act of diplomacy and military readiness. In Suva, Australian diplomats worked tirelessly to maintain communication with Fijian authorities, ensuring that their mission remained transparent. Messages from Canberra stressed Australia's intent to avoid interfering with Fiji's internal politics while prioritizing the safety of its citizens. Inside the Australian High Commission, tension simmered. The consulate staff juggled logistics for a potential mass evacuation. They worked tirelessly to track the locations of Australian nationals scattered across the islands, preparing emergency instructions and contingency plans. Lines of communication buzzed with activity as worried expatriates sought clarity on their future. The Fijian junta, however, remained skeptical. Rabuka's government monitored Australia's growing military presence with unease. The sight of warships just outside territorial waters felt like a silent threat. Fijian military commanders questioned whether Australia's intentions were purely humanitarian or a prelude to intervention. The political atmosphere in Fiji grew more charged, adding layers of complexity to Australia's mission. Meanwhile, the ships in the task force maintained their position, ready for any eventuality. Their crews performed routine drills to keep prepared, but they also knew the real mission would not involve combat. It would test their ability to manage logistics, diplomacy, and safety under pressure. The soldiers of B Company, 1 RAR, stationed aboard HMAS Tobruk, spent their days in limbo. As part of Australia's rapid deployment force, they were trained for crises, but this mission felt different. The lack of direct combat objectives left many wondering if their readiness would ever be tested. Yet the uncertainty itself was a challenge, demanding vigilance in the face of inaction. On board the ships, the routine was punctuated by planning meetings, drills, and the hum of radio updates. Soldiers and sailors alike grew restless, their minds wandering to the lives they'd left behind in Australia. For some, the thought of protecting families and civilians kept them grounded. For others, the long wait wore at their morale. The officers on board knew the importance of keeping their teams focused. Evacuation scenarios were rehearsed with precision, and schedules were crafted to keep minds and bodies engaged. Beneath the surface, however, an unspoken question lingered: would they return home without ever setting foot on Fijian soil? On May 28, the situation in Fiji began to show signs of stabilization. Rabuka's regime, having declared martial law, had consolidated its control over the country. Acts of violence and unrest, though still a concern, were less frequent. The RFMF's grip tightened, and the threat of widespread chaos seemed to recede. Reports from Suva painted a cautious picture. While the political situation remained tense, diplomatic channels between Fiji and Australia remained open. The Australian High Commission noted that the majority of expatriates felt safe enough to stay, at least for the time being. For the ADF, this shift presented a conundrum. While the immediate threat to Australian citizens had subsided, the task force remained on alert. The ships held their positions, and the soldiers of 1 RAR continued their preparations, ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. The operation, though still active, now felt more like an exercise in patience than an urgent mission. By May 29, Operation Morris Dance came to an end without a single evacuation. The situation in Fiji had stabilized enough for the Australian government to stand down its forces. The task force received orders to return home, and the ships began their long journey back to Australian waters. For the soldiers and sailors involved, the operation was both a relief and a reflection. Many felt pride in their readiness to act, while others grappled with the anticlimactic nature of the mission. Their presence alone had sent a clear message of Australia's commitment to protecting its citizens, but the lack of direct action left some wondering about the broader impact of their deployment. In Canberra, officials evaluated the operation as a success. The ADF had demonstrated its ability to mobilize quickly and effectively, showcasing Australia's regional capabilities. Diplomatically, the mission had maintained the delicate balance of intervention and restraint, avoiding further escalation in Fiji. The story of Operation Morris Dance would soon fade from public memory, overshadowed by other events. Yet for those who had stood ready to act, it was a chapter of quiet resolve, a testament to the importance of preparation in the face of uncertainty. As HMAS Sydney, Tobruk, and the other vessels departed Fiji's waters, the men and women on board found themselves reflecting on the operation. For many, this had been their first deployment beyond routine exercises. The looming potential for conflict had given the mission a sense of gravity, yet its peaceful resolution left a mix of pride and unspent energy. In the mess halls, conversations shifted between relief at avoiding violence and questions about what could have been. Some sailors believed their mere presence had averted a greater crisis, while others wondered if they would have been ready to face combat if the need had arisen. On deck, the ocean stretched endlessly, offering a quiet backdrop for soldiers and sailors to process the past weeks. For the officers, the return journey was an opportunity to assess their performance. Rear Admiral Peter Sinclair held briefings with his senior staff, reviewing the operation's logistics and communication efforts. The success of Operation Morris Dance lay not in dramatic action but in the preparedness and precision that kept disaster at bay. While the ADF ships navigated back to Australia, families waited anxiously for their loved ones. For weeks, news reports had painted a picture of uncertainty, and though no combat had occurred, the potential for danger weighed heavily on those back home. Letters written before deployment, promising safety and swift returns, had taken on a new poignancy as the days dragged on. In Townsville, the families of 1RR soldiers gathered at the base, exchanging updates and supporting one another. Many had spent sleepless nights watching news broadcasts, searching for glimpses of the ships or mentions of Fiji. The arrival of messages confirming the end of the operation brought waves of relief, but also anticipation for reunions. The homecoming, though joyous, would be tempered by the stories of what might have been. The soldiers and sailors would carry with them not tales of battle but the quiet pride of having been ready to protect others, even if the call never came. In Suva, the Australian High Commission began to wind down its heightened state of readiness. Staff members who had worked tirelessly to coordinate communication and logistics took a moment to reflect. While the threat of evacuation had loomed large, diplomacy had ultimately prevailed. Their efforts to maintain dialogue with Fijian authorities had kept doors open and ensured that Australia's intent was understood. Ambassador Mike Stone, who had been at the forefront of negotiations, remained cautious. The stability in Fiji was still tenuous, and the coup's broader implications for the region were uncertain. However, he took solace in the knowledge that no lives had been lost and that Australia had acted with both resolve and restraint. For the local staff of the embassy, many of them Fijian nationals, the coup had been a deeply personal experience. They had watched their country teeter on the brink of chaos, and while grateful for Australia's support, they remained uncertain about what the future held for Fiji under military rule. Upon returning to Australian shores, the ADF began a thorough review of Operation Morris Dance. Military leaders emphasized the importance of preparedness and coordination, praising the speed with which the task force had mobilized. However, the operation also highlighted areas for improvement. Communication between the various branches of the ADF had been tested, revealing gaps that would need addressing. One key takeaway was the value of maintaining a flexible and multi-capable force. The Navy's ability to position its vessels near Fiji had been critical, as had the rapid deployment of 1RR troops. The integration of amphibious ships like HMAS Tobruk and air assets like the C-130 Hercules had showcased the ADF's potential for joint operations. Politically, the operation underscored the challenges of acting in the Pacific. Australia's role as a regional leader came with responsibilities and risks. While the mission had avoided direct conflict, it had required careful navigation of diplomatic sensitivities. The lessons of Morris Dance would inform future operations, shaping how Australia approached crises in its immediate region. The story of Operation Mount Hope III. The year was 1988, and the world was a patchwork of Cold War tensions and proxy battles. Amidst the sun-scorched expanse of northern Chad, echoes of a bloody conflict still linger. The region, once a battlefield between Libya and Chad, now held secrets abandoned in the sands, secrets the superpowers sought to uncover. Among the debris of war lay a solitary relic, a Soviet-made Mi-25 Hind D attack helicopter, left behind at the Wadi Dum Air Base. To the untrained eye, it was just a weathered war machine, but to military strategists in Washington, it was a goldmine of intelligence. Its capture could offer insights into Soviet technology, and more importantly, serve as a quiet victory in the ongoing Cold War chess game. Thus began Operation Mount Hope III, a clandestine mission so daring it bordered on the fantastical. Spearheaded by the elite 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, nicknamed the Night Stalkers, the operation promised to be a testament to ingenuity, precision, and the high stakes of geopolitics. The story that unfolded in the heart of the Sahara would be one of intrigue, courage, and the relentless pursuit of an edge in a divided world. The desert had a long memory. For 8 months, the so-called Toyota War, a lightning-fast conflict named after the pickup trucks Chadian forces used as technicals, had raged across this arid expanse. By September 1987, Chad, with its outnumbered forces and ragtag weaponry, had dealt a humiliating defeat to the Libyan army, forcing their retreat and leaving the Al Yuzu Strip littered with military debris. Among the spoils was the Wadi Dum Air Base, a once thriving Libyan stronghold. The base now lay in eerie silence, its hangars stripped, and its airfields abandoned. The Mi-25 Hind D sat like a ghost, its olive-green fuselage a stark contrast to the golden sand. For Chadian soldiers, it was a trophy of war. For the U.S., it was a rare opportunity. Washington moved swiftly. Intelligence reports hinted that other nations, including France, were eyeing the wreckage. The race was on to recover the helicopter before it vanished into the shadows of international competition. A plan began to form, a high-risk, high-reward operation that would require meticulous preparation and a touch of audacity. In the halls of Washington and Paris, negotiations unfolded in secret. Chad, though victorious, was still a fragile state, reliant on international support. For a price, they agreed to let the Americans recover one Mi-25. $2 million and a cache of FIM-92 Stinger missiles sealed the deal. France, not to be left out, secured a badly damaged Hind D for itself. For the Americans, the mission was clear: extract the helicopter from Wadi Dum without detection. It would require the skills of the 160th SOAR, experts in nighttime, precision operations. The stakes were high. Failure would mean not just embarrassment but potentially sparking international tensions. Training began in earnest. In the deserts of White Sands, New Mexico, Chinook helicopters carried water containers to simulate the hind's weight. Night after night, the pilots rehearsed their maneuvers, perfecting the art of stealth and speed. To the outside world, it was routine military exercise. To those involved, it was preparation for one of the most daring heists in military history. By April 1988, the Night Stalkers were ready. The operation would be conducted under the cover of darkness to avoid detection by satellites or curious eyes on the ground. Two specially outfitted MH-47 Chinook helicopters would carry out the mission, with one designated to lift the Mi-25 as an external load. Every detail, down to the weight distribution and fuel calculations, was planned to perfection. The Chinooks were disassembled and flown to Chad aboard a massive C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft. Upon arrival, the crew reassembled the helicopters at a discreet location, keeping their presence a tightly guarded secret. For days, they familiarized themselves with the terrain, practicing short hops to simulate the planned extraction route. The men of the 160th SOAR were seasoned veterans, but even they felt the pressure of this mission. A single misstep could jeopardize months of planning. To lighten the mood, the crew shared stories over coffee and rations, but the tension lingered. The helicopter would be lifted from a region still rife with instability, and every second counted. Wadi Dum was a graveyard of war. The Libyans had abandoned the base in a hasty retreat, leaving behind a treasure trove of equipment, including the Hindi. The Americans had chosen this particular helicopter for a reason. It was one of the few intact airframes, a pristine specimen of Soviet engineering. Under the relentless desert sun, the Hind had become a silent sentinel, its green paint faded but its imposing shape unmistakable. Local scavengers had stripped much of the base, but the helicopter remained untouched, a reminder of Libya's defeat. On the chosen night, the Night Stalkers began their approach. The Chinooks flew low, skimming the desert to avoid radar detection. Dust swirled around their rotors as they descended near the airbase. A team of ground personnel, including security and engineers, quickly secured the area. Their goal, attach the Hind to the Chinook's external sling and lift off before anyone noticed. The crew worked with clockwork precision. Each bolt and strap was double-checked under the dim glow of flashlights. Above them, the Chinook hovered steadily, its powerful rotors kicking up sandstorms. As the loadmaster gave the signal, the Mi-25 rose from the ground, a leviathan plucked from its sandy grave. The journey back was as treacherous as the extraction itself. The Chinook, burdened by the heavy load, flew at a reduced speed. The crew navigated using infrared systems, ensuring they remained invisible to potential observers. Along the route, they made several planned stops to refuel from a C-130 Hercules that trailed them in support. The refueling stops were tense. Every minute spent on the ground increased the risk of discovery. The crew worked in silence, their movements efficient and deliberate. As the Chinook lifted off each time, a wave of relief swept over the team, but they knew the mission wasn't over until the helicopter reached safety. Finally, as dawn approached, the Chinooks crossed into a secure zone. The crew allowed themselves a rare moment of celebration, knowing they had achieved what many thought impossible. The Hindi was on its way to the United States, a trophy of the Cold War and a testament to the ingenuity of the Night Stalkers. As the Chinook helicopters touched down at the designated airfield, a sense of triumph filled the air. The mission had gone off without a hitch, but the team knew better than to let their guard down. The desert silence had been their ally, but now, under the first rays of daylight, the Hindi stood as a glaring prize, one that could draw unwanted attention. The helicopter was carefully lowered onto the tarmac. Engineers and intelligence officers swarmed around it, marveling at the captured Soviet technology. Every inch of the airframe was meticulously documented. Even in its dusty, weathered state, the Hind exuded an aura of raw power. Over the following hours, the crew disassembled the helicopter once more for transport. Parts were carefully packed into crates and loaded onto a C-5 Galaxy bound for a secure facility in the United States. As the cargo doors closed, the crew exchanged knowing glances. They had achieved something extraordinary, a feat of precision, daring, and stealth. Back in the United States, the Hind D was a treasure trove of intelligence. Military analysts and engineers gathered at a top-secret facility to study the helicopter in detail. For years, the Mi-25 had been a symbol of Soviet might, a flying tank capable of both devastating firepower and troop transport. Now, every rivet and circuit was laid bare. The Americans were particularly interested in the helicopter's avionics and weapon systems. Engineers worked tirelessly to reverse engineer components, uncovering the secrets of its radar, targeting systems, and armor. The findings were not just academic, they would influence the design of future U.S. aircraft, ensuring a technological edge in the Cold War. But the Hind also had a symbolic value. Photographs of the captured helicopter were carefully staged and leaked to select allies, a subtle message to both friends and foes. The operation was a reminder that the U.S. could strike deep into contested territory and claim what it needed. News of the operation spread quietly but surely. In military and intelligence circles, Operation Mount Hope III became the stuff of legend. For the Night Stalkers, it was another notch in their belt, a mission that highlighted their unmatched expertise in aerial operations. In Chad, the recovery of the Hind D marked the end of an era. The war-torn nation had moved on from its conflict with Libya, but the scars of the Toyota War remained. For the Chadian soldiers who had stood guard at Wadi Dum, the sight of the helicopter being lifted into the night sky was bittersweet. The Hind was a trophy of their victory, now bound for a distant land. In the years that followed, the recovered helicopter would fade from public memory, its significance overshadowed by larger Cold War events. But for those who participated in Operation Mount Hope III, it remained a defining moment, a testament to teamwork, ingenuity, and the quiet heroics of soldiers working in the shadows. While Operation Mount Hope III was a tactical success, its implications reverberated through diplomatic channels. The Cold War was as much a battle of perception as it was of military strength, and the operation became a subtle yet effective psychological maneuver. In Moscow, whispers of the Hind's capture stirred unease. The Soviets prided themselves on their military exports, particularly the formidable Mi-25. Its loss raised questions about the strength and reliability of their alliances. Libya, one of their key partners, had not only lost a war but allowed a prized piece of Soviet engineering to fall into enemy hands. In Paris, the French government monitored the operation with interest. Their own recovery of damaged Soviet equipment from Chad had been a collaborative effort with the US, but there was a quiet competition in play. The French knew that American intelligence would exploit the Hind for more than just technical insights. It was a propaganda tool in the high-stakes game of global influence. For the 160th SOR, success was not a reason to rest. The unit's operations were veiled in secrecy, and Mount Hope III only bolstered their reputation as masters of clandestine missions. The Night Stalkers moved on to new assignments, their exploits rarely discussed outside their own circles. Captain Dale Mitchell, one of the pilots on the mission, carried the memories of that night like a badge of honor. He recalled the endless hours of preparation, the tense moments during the lift, and the eerie silence of Wadi Dum. For Mitchell, the mission exemplified the spirit of the unit: unwavering dedication, meticulous planning, and trust in one another. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts continued to pore over the data collected from the Hind. They discovered design flaws, innovative features, and tactical insights that shaped the development of future U.S. aircraft. The operation's true value lay not just in the physical helicopter but in the wealth of knowledge it provided. As years passed, Operation Mount Hope III became a footnote in Cold War history, overshadowed by larger confrontations like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But for those who knew of it, the operation represented the ingenuity and precision that defined Cold War-era military strategy. The Hind D itself was preserved in a classified hangar, its secrets meticulously catalogued. For engineers, it was a case study in Soviet aeronautics. For the military, it was a symbol of the US's ability to adapt and overcome. And for the Night Stalkers, it was a reminder of their motto: Night Stalkers don't quit. In Chad, the scars of war began to fade. The desert, ever shifting and eternal, reclaimed the remnants of the conflict. Wadi Dum became a memory, its silent airfields a testament to the fleeting nature of war. Yet the story of the Hind DS recovery lingered, told in whispers among soldiers and strategists who marveled at the audacity of it all. In the present day, the story of Operation Mount Hope III serves as a case study in military strategy courses. It is a lesson in coordination, innovation, and the delicate balance of geopolitics. Students learn about the significance of the mission, not just for its tactical success but for its broader implications in the Cold War theater. The operation also holds lessons for intelligence agencies worldwide. It highlights the value of collaboration, the importance of adaptability, and the power of perception in global affairs. For the men and women who lived it, however, it remains deeply personal, a memory of a moment when history unfolded in the quiet shadows of the desert. In Chad, the aftermath of the Toyota War brought both triumph and turmoil. The Chadian military, having expelled Libyan forces, celebrated their victory, but the nation still grappled with internal challenges. Infrastructure lay in ruins, and tribal divisions simmered beneath the surface. The desert was quiet, but the echoes of conflict lingered in the minds of its people. For Chadian President Hissène Habré, the success against Libya bolstered his international standing. The US and France, impressed by Chad's resilience, increased their support. Yet, behind the scenes, Habré faced accusations of authoritarianism and human rights abuses. The war had united Chad temporarily, but peace came with its own set of struggles. Despite these challenges, Wadi Dum remained a symbol of Chadian resilience. For locals, it was a site of national pride, a reminder of their ability to stand against a more powerful adversary. The abandoned base became a makeshift marketplace, its runways used for everything from livestock trading to community gatherings. As American engineers dismantled the captured Hind D, they discovered its complexities. The helicopter was both rugged and sophisticated, designed to withstand the harshest conditions while delivering devastating firepower. Its heavily armored cockpit and advanced targeting systems revealed the Soviet emphasis on survivability and efficiency. One key discovery was the Hind's ability to operate effectively as a flying fortress. With room for 8 troops and a suite of weapons, it was a versatile tool for both combat and transport. US analysts compared it to their own designs, identifying areas for improvement and innovation. For military planners, the operation offered a deeper understanding of Soviet tactics. The Hind's design reflected a strategy of brute force and adaptability, traits that underscored the USSR's approach to warfare. This knowledge proved invaluable in shaping future US equipment and training. While the Night Stalkers received much of the credit for the operation, other unsung heroes played critical roles. The ground team, composed of engineers, intelligence officers, and local Chadian collaborators, worked tirelessly to ensure the mission's success. One such figure was Sergeant Maria Carter, a logistics expert who coordinated the movement of supplies and personnel. For her, the mission was a delicate balance of precision and improvisation. Every crate, every bolt mattered, she later recalled. In the chaos of the desert, even the smallest detail could make or break the mission. Local Chadians also contributed, providing crucial information about the airbase and its surroundings. Their knowledge of the terrain and willingness to cooperate made the extraction smoother. Though their names went unrecorded, their contributions were remembered by those who served alongside them. While the Americans celebrated their success, French intelligence watched closely. The French had a vested interest in Chad, having supported the nation during the Toyota War. Their own recovery of Soviet equipment had been less publicized but equally significant. In the halls of the Élysée Palace, French officials debated the implications of the U.S. operation. While the two nations were allies, there was an undercurrent of competition. France viewed Chad as part of its sphere of influence, and the American presence was both a boon and a challenge. Yet, there was mutual respect between the two nations' militaries. Joint operations like the recovery of Soviet missile systems demonstrated that cooperation could yield significant benefits. Behind closed doors, French and American analysts exchanged findings, piecing together a clearer picture of Soviet military capabilities. In the months following Operation Mount Hope III, remnants of the Libyan-Chadian conflict continued to surface across the desert. Weapons, vehicles, and abandoned infrastructure dotted the landscape, a testament to the ferocity of the Toyota War. Scavengers combed through the wreckage, salvaging anything of value, from twisted metal to ammunition. For intelligence agencies, the desert was an open book waiting to be read. American and French operatives discreetly returned to northern Chad, seeking additional Soviet equipment left behind by the retreating Libyan forces. Each find was a piece of a larger puzzle, providing insights into the Soviet military-industrial complex. Wadi Dum, once the crown jewel of Libyan dominance in the region, became a haunting reminder of their defeat. The base's skeletal hangars and sand-covered runways were stark symbols of a war that had drained both nations of resources and morale. For the Chadian people, it was a bittersweet victory, a place where liberation was won at a great cost. As the Cold War approached its final years, Chad's role in the global geopolitical theater began to shift. With Libya's retreat, the region saw a temporary lull in conflict, but new challenges emerged. Internal political struggles and tribal divisions threatened the fragile stability that had been achieved. For the United States, Chad remained an important ally in a region of strategic significance. Military advisors continued to support the Chadian government, providing training and equipment to bolster their defenses. France maintained its influence as well, balancing its role as a protector and a political player in the region. Amid these developments, the legacy of Operation Mount Hope III endured. The mission was a reminder of the lengths nations would go to in pursuit of technological superiority. The Hind D, now a classified artifact in the United States, stood as a silent witness to this relentless pursuit. For the men and women of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the success of Mount Hope III was a defining moment. Their ability to execute a mission of such complexity and precision cemented their reputation as one of the world's most elite aviation units. Captain Dale Mitchell, reflecting on the operation years later, often spoke of the camaraderie that defined the mission. "It wasn't just the flying," he said. "It was the trust. Trust in your crew, in your training, in the plan. That's what made it work. The Night Stalkers continued to undertake daring missions around the globe, each one a testament to their motto, Night Stalkers don't quit. Mount Hope 3 became part of their lore, a story passed down to new recruits as an example of what the regiment could achieve. In a secure hangar somewhere in the United States, the captured Mi-25 Hind-D sat preserved, its olive-green fuselage a stark reminder of its Soviet origins. Engineers continued to study it, while military strategists used its design as a benchmark for improving U.S. aviation technology. The Hind was more than a helicopter, it was a symbol of Cold War ingenuity and ambition. For the United States, its recovery was a quiet triumph, a moment that demonstrated the power of persistence and precision. For the Soviet Union, it was a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities that lay within their global influence. Years later, the story of the Hind and Operation Mount Hope 3 would surface in declassified documents and interviews. It became a tale of daring and ingenuity, a testament to the lengths nations would go to during the twilight of the Cold War. Operation PARAQUET, a narrative of strategy and survival. It was the early days of April 1982. As autumn painted the skies of the southern hemisphere with hues of crimson, tensions brewed far from the British Isles, in the icy waters of the South Atlantic. The wind carried whispers of war over the jagged mountains and icy inlets of South Georgia Island, a remote outpost bracing for the storm of conflict. Britain and Argentina stood on the precipice of a clash that would ripple across oceans, drawing the world's gaze to the Falkland Islands. Operation PARAQUET, the mission to reclaim South Georgia, would soon unfold, a tale of bravery, uncertainty, and the resilience of human spirit. The air in Port Stanley grew tense as the first reports of Argentine movements reached British ears. News traveled slowly from the far reaches of South Georgia Island, where a skeletal crew of British Antarctic Survey scientists had settled into a routine of isolation and research. Yet, on March 19, 1982, their solitude shattered. An unauthorized Argentine landing party had raised their flag at Leith Harbor, marking the prelude to a broader campaign. Far from any bustling metropolis, this island became a symbol of sovereignty that neither nation would relinquish without a fight. As Argentine forces reinforced their presence, their submarine, PARAQUET Santa Fe, became a critical instrument of control. Beneath the icy waters, its silhouette was a harbinger of power, quietly shadowing the coastline as it ferried supplies and soldiers. Argentina's tactical decision to occupy South Georgia was part of their broader ambition: control the Falklands, assert dominion, and challenge British resolve. Across the Atlantic, the call to arms resonated in London. The newly assembled British task force, led by Commodore Michael Clapp and Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, readied their ships. Among them, the destroyer HMS Antrim and her Wessex helicopter, affectionately named Humphrey, would become pivotal in the unfolding drama. Orders came swiftly: sail south, reclaim South Georgia, and deny Argentina any further foothold. As dawn broke on April 23, a chilling fog embraced the British task force converging on South Georgia's icy shores. The sea's stillness was deceptive, masking danger beneath its surface. HMS Conqueror, a nuclear-powered submarine, prowled silently, its sonar listening intently for signs of the Argentine submarine, Santa Fe. The waters around Grytviken, the island's abandoned whaling station, teemed with possibility and peril. In the claustrophobic belly of Santa Fe, Argentine sailors braced themselves. The cramped quarters reeked of diesel and salt, the rhythmic hum of machinery their constant companion. Captain Alfredo Astiz, infamous for his brutal tactics during Argentina's dirty war, commanded the garrison ashore. His orders were clear: hold South Georgia at all costs. But fate was about to shift with a sudden, violent twist. The sky hung low with iron-gray clouds as British helicopters took to the air. From HMS Antrim, Humphrey lifted off, its rotors cutting through the dense air as it tracked Santa Fe surfacing near King Edward Point. With precision and resolve, the Wessex unleashed its depth charges, shaking the sea with thunderous detonations. The submarine lurched, listing as explosions tore into its hull. Panic erupted within Santa Fe. Water gushed through ruptures, and sailors scrambled to contain the damage. Desperation fueled their actions as they fired small arms at the circling aircraft. The British pressed their advantage. Additional Lynx and Wasp helicopters peppered the vessel with rockets and machine gun fire. Surrounded and crippled, Santa Fe limped toward shore. Captain Lagos, bloodied but unbowed, ordered a final retreat. He knew their fight was over. As his men scuttled to safety, he surrendered the damaged submarine. Aboard HMS Plymouth, British sailors watched with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. The first victory was theirs, but more trials lay ahead. When British Marines set foot on South Georgia on April 25, snow crunched under their boots. The mountains loomed like silent sentinels, their peaks draped in ice. Every step forward was a calculated risk. Guided by the dim glow of reconnaissance, they advanced toward Gripenton, rifles ready. The Argentine defenders held their breath as shadows moved beyond their sight. Their fortified positions offered cover but little hope. Word of the submarine's demise had shaken their confidence. Still, they clung to their orders, resist and endure. In the fading afternoon light, a voice pierced the air. "This is Major Guy Sheridan of the Royal Marines. Surrender, and no harm will come to you." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, one by one, Argentine soldiers laid down their arms. Gripenton was taken without a shot fired. Relief washed over weary British forces as they secured the harbor. The Union Jack once again flew above South Georgia. Operation PARAQUET had succeeded. The British reclaimed South Georgia in a decisive blow, restoring a fragment of their sovereignty. The Falklands War would rage on, claiming lives and testing the mettle of nations. Yet, this victory, small and significant, proved that resolve, strategy, and courage could bend the tide of history. Beneath the wintry sky, the waves carried stories of triumph and tragedy, whispers of men who fought in shadows and light. Operation PARAQUET had etched its name in the annals of history, a chapter of bravery in a war far from home. The news of South Georgia's liberation raced across the globe. In Buenos Aires, it stirred both defiance and doubt within the Argentine military command. For General Leopoldo Galtieri, this was a blow to national pride, but it strengthened his resolve to fortify the Falklands. Meanwhile, in London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared the operation a triumph of British resolve and skill. The victory bolstered national morale, yet a sense of solemnity remained. Many knew this was only the beginning of a long and costly campaign. On the deck of HMS Plymouth, sailors basked in the frigid winds of the Southern Ocean. The sight of South Georgia fading into the horizon filled them with pride, but their hearts carried the weight of comrades lost and dangers yet to come. Discussions about their next mission simmered below deck. Maps and plans sprawled across tables as commanders anticipated their next strategic move toward the Falklands. Every mind sharpened with the urgency of reclaiming what was lost, while letters home lay half-written in the flickering light of the ship's mess. For the crew of HMS Conqueror, the mission was far from over. The nuclear-powered submarine had been a silent guardian beneath the sea, ensuring that the waters remained free of Argentine threats. In the tight, claustrophobic space, the air hummed with tension. Every sonar ping was a heartbeat in the deep, each signal analyzed with precision. Their target was elusive, a ghostly silhouette of potential danger that could lurk in any shadow. Captain Christopher Refford Brown remained vigilant, knowing that patience was their greatest weapon. The victory over Santa Fe had shown the power of surprise and timing. Now, Conqueror would lie in wait, ready to strike when needed. The darkness of the ocean offered protection and peril alike, but the submarine was a fortress of technology and determination. Every creak of the hull seemed to echo the pulse of a nation holding its breath for the next encounter. On the Falklands, Argentine forces dug in, fortifying their positions as the cold winds swept across the barren landscape. Trenches and bunkers lined the hills surrounding Port Stanley, where soldiers from distant provinces stood guard. Many of them were young conscripts, their rifles clutched tightly in trembling hands. Fear mixed with pride as they stared into the vast Atlantic, knowing an enemy fleet approached. Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz, now a prisoner following the events at South Georgia, became a symbol of Argentina's ambitions and failures. His infamous reputation, earned during the country's dirty war, only hardened British resolve to press forward. But for the soldiers left behind, it was not politics or pride that fueled their will to fight, it was the camaraderie forged in the biting cold and the shared hope of surviving another day. The British fleet moved steadily south, its gray silhouettes cutting through icy waters. HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible led the charge, carrying Sea Harrier jets poised for action. The roar of engines filled the air as pilots ran through drills, their minds focused on the battles ahead. They knew the Argentines had air superiority over the islands. Every sortie would be a deadly dance of speed and precision against well-armed adversaries. Among the pilots, Lieutenant David Morgan prepared for his first combat mission. The sleek shape of his Sea Harrier sat waiting, its dark metal frame reflecting the cold sunlight. He felt the weight of history upon his shoulders, the stories of those who had flown before him in battles far from these southern seas. Steady hands, sharp eyes, he whispered to himself, echoing advice from a mentor. The mission briefing replayed in his mind as the countdown to launch began. As darkness cloaked the sea, British commandos aboard the frigate HMS Plymouth readied their gear. The objective was clear: disrupt Argentine operations on Pebble Island. Intelligence reports indicated that a small airstrip housed ground attack aircraft capable of striking the fleet. The task force could not afford such a threat to remain. Major Cedric Delves led the mission. His voice was calm, steady as he spoke to his men. We strike fast, we strike hard, and we get out. No mistakes. Their faces, hardened by training, betrayed no fear. When the signal came, the raiding party slipped into inflatable boats and rowed silently toward the shore. Waves lapped at the hulls as shadows crept across the sand. The night would soon echo with the crack of rifle fire and the roar of explosions. The raid on Pebble Island erupted with a fury that shattered the stillness of night. A flare arced high into the sky, bathing the airstrip in stark white light. British commandos moved like phantoms, their blackened faces blending with the shadows. As they reached their targets, demolition charges were set with swift precision. Explosions ripped through the air, consuming the Argentine aircraft in balls of flame. Pilots, awakened by the chaos, scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The commandos, disciplined and efficient, neutralized resistance with minimal casualties. Engines roared to life as vehicles were destroyed, the air thick with smoke and the acrid tang of burning fuel. Major Delves led the withdrawal, his heartbeat steady amid the cacophony of war. The mission was a resounding success. 11 Argentine aircraft lay in ruins. As the team slipped back into the sea, their spirits buoyed by triumph, they left behind a field of wreckage that would cripple Argentina's air power in the coming battles. The mood aboard HMS Hermes was one of anticipation and anxiety. British commanders gathered around maps spread across a war room table. The Falklands campaign was a series of gambles, each move a calculation of risk and reward. Admiral Sandy Woodward faced mounting pressure as intelligence reports flooded in. Argentine fighter jets patrolled the skies, and their Exocet missiles loomed as a deadly threat. Woodward's thoughts turned to the critical issue of logistics. Every strike required careful coordination, from fuel supplies to aircraft maintenance. The Sea Harriers, though superior in maneuverability, were few in number. Each one lost would tilt the balance of power. Decisions carried the weight of lives, soldiers, sailors, and airmen entrusted to his command. With steely resolve, he issued orders that would shape the next stage of the war. High above the South Atlantic, a Sea Harrier streaked through the sky. Lieutenant David Morgan gripped the controls, scanning the horizon for movement. The silence of altitude was deceptive, a calm before the storm. Suddenly, radar lit up with warnings. Argentine Mirage fighters closed in fast. Contact. 2 bogies at 10 o'clock. Morgan's wingman called out. Instinct and training fused as Morgan rolled his Harrier into an evasive maneuver. Tracers zipped past his canopy, the enemy's guns spitting fire. He banked hard, pulling into a vertical climb that pushed the limits of gravity. Behind him, a missile streaked by, missing its mark by inches. The engagement lasted mere minutes but felt like an eternity. As one Mirage broke formation, Morgan seized his chance. A Sidewinder missile locked on with a piercing tone. He squeezed the trigger. The missile roared away, its contrail streaking toward the fleeing target. A second later, an explosion lit the sky, the Mirage disintegrating into flaming debris. It was a victory, but the war above the Falklands was far from over. By late May 1982, the British fleet prepared for its most dangerous move yet, landing troops on East Falkland to begin the ground campaign. The chosen site was San Carlos Water, a sheltered inlet surrounded by hills. It was known to sailors as Bomb Alley, for it lay within reach of Argentine air bases. Every ship and man would be a target. On the morning of May 21st, the invasion began. HMS Fearless and HMS Intrepid launched landing craft filled with Royal Marines and paratroopers. As soldiers splashed ashore, the cliffs echoed with the distant drone of enemy aircraft. Overhead, Sea Harriers circled like watchful hawks, ready to intercept attackers. Yet the stillness of the water belied the fury about to descend. Suddenly, the air filled with the wail of sirens and the roar of jet engines. Argentine A-4 Skyhawks and Dagger fighters streaked low over the hills. Bombs plunged from their bellies, splashing into the sea or striking the decks of British ships. Flames leapt from HMS Ardent as explosions tore through its hull. Sailors fought to extinguish the fires while others scrambled to safety. Despite heavy damage, they held their position, determined to protect the landing. On the deck of HMS Ardent, chaos reigned. Smoke billowed into the sky as fires raged below. Lieutenant Commander Alan West, the ship's captain, barked orders with unflinching resolve. Fire crews, to the forward section. Get those hoses working. His voice cut through the cacophony of flames and sirens. Shells exploded around them as Argentine planes made a second pass. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns, their faces grim with determination. Tracer rounds streaked toward the attacking Skyhawks, tearing into metal and sending one spiraling into the sea. But even as enemy planes fell, the damage was done. The ship listed heavily, its deck a smoldering ruin. "Abandoned ship," West finally ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of loss. Crew members leapt into the freezing water, clutching life rafts as debris rained down. Nearby, other British vessels rushed to aid survivors. Courage and camaraderie shone amid the flames, a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who served. While the air and sea battles raged, British ground forces moved inland. The terrain was harsh, boggy peat, jagged rocks, and chilling winds. Royal Marines and paratroopers advanced cautiously, their eyes scanning every ridge. Argentine snipers lurked in hidden positions, and every step forward could trigger a firefight. On Mount Kent, patrols exchanged sporadic gunfire with Argentine forces. Each skirmish was a test of endurance and strategy. Under the cover of darkness, British special forces crept toward enemy positions. The silence of night was broken only by whispered commands and the crunch of boots on gravel. The war had come to the hills, where courage would be measured in shadows and steel. The night sky above Mount Kent was a canvas of stars, cold and distant, as British special forces crept forward. The darkness shrouded them, but danger was ever present. Every rustle of wind and crack of stone echoed in their minds as the enemy's presence loomed just beyond the ridgeline. The mission was to secure a key position overlooking Port Stanley, and the stakes were as high as the mountain itself. Captain Gavin Hamilton led the patrol with the calm demeanor of a seasoned warrior. His eyes scanned the horizon, where the silhouette of Argentine sentries broke the skyline. One wrong move could ignite a firefight that would echo down the slopes. His hand signaled a halt. The team froze, holding their breath as an enemy patrol passed within meters. Minutes stretched into eternity before they moved again, shadows against the stone. By dawn, the ridge was theirs. The British foothold on Mount Kent would become the gateway to victory, but not without cost. Skirmishes erupted as Argentine forces regrouped, their resistance fierce and determined. For the men who fought on that frozen ground, courage and endurance became their only companions. With Mount Kent secure, British commanders set their sights on Goose Green. The small settlement held strategic importance and was heavily fortified by Argentine forces. The battle would test the mettle of the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, 2 Para, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert H. Jones, a man of unshakable resolve. At dawn on May 28, artillery fire announced the assault. The paratroopers advanced through open terrain, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Argentine machine gun nests erupted with deadly fire, pinning them down. Colonel Jones, determined to break the stalemate, led a daring charge against the enemy trenches. His actions inspired his men, but at the cost of his life. He fell in a hail of bullets, his sacrifice echoing the valor of generations past. Despite heavy casualties, 2 Para pressed forward. By evening, Goose Green was in British hands. Over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendered, a decisive victory that electrified British morale. The cost was steep, but the battle proved that grit and determination could overcome entrenched defenses. As the Union Jack rose above Goose Green, the battlefield lay littered with the remnants of war, shell casings, shattered helmets, and silent figures draped in the fog of death. Soldiers who had survived embraced one another, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Letters home would tell of victory, but the memories of fallen comrades weighed heavily in their hearts. For the Argentine prisoners, defeat came with shame and sorrow. Many were young conscripts, far from home and caught in the machinations of a conflict they had not chosen. Their rifles lay in piles, surrendered symbols of a fight that had taken them to the edge of survival. The British treated them with dignity, a gesture that transcended the bitterness of war. As night fell over the Falklands, the wind carried the whisper of those who had given their lives. The campaign was far from over, but the resolve of the British soldiers grew stronger with each battle fought. Every hill, every village, and every victory would bring them closer to reclaiming the islands. The story of Operation Black Buck. In the cold dawn of 1982, the world was transfixed by a distant conflict raging in the windswept Falkland Islands. 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly shore, these rugged outposts became the focus of an audacious military campaign. Amid the swirling tension between Britain and Argentina, the Royal Air Force unveiled a mission so daring that it would stretch the limits of human endurance and technological capability. Operation Black Buck, a series of long-range airstrikes, aimed to cripple Argentine positions and reshape the balance of the war. The stage was set at RAF Ascension Island, a tiny speck in the South Atlantic. Here, Vulcan bombers and Victor tankers prepared for a mission that would become legendary, not just for its strategic importance but for the stories of the men whose lives converged at the heart of the operation. Through the eyes of engineers fine-tuning the aging Vulcans, pilots wrestling with the challenges of unprecedented range, and radar operators tracking the enemy, the story of Operation Black Buck begins. A tale not of a single hero, but of collective determination, unfolds in the tension-laden skies and turbulent seas of the South Atlantic. The Falkland Islands, nestled in icy isolation, were thrust into the global spotlight when Argentine forces launched their surprise invasion in April 1982. Port Stanley, the capital, became a garrison under foreign control, its quiet streets now lined with soldiers. Local residents found themselves caught between loyalty to Britain and the sudden reality of occupation. Meanwhile, in London, the British government faced an unthinkable dilemma. The islands, though remote and sparsely populated, represented a piece of national pride. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared the invasion unacceptable, galvanizing the military into action. A task force was assembled to sail south, but another challenge emerged: the airstrikes required to disrupt Argentine defenses before the main assault. RAF strategists proposed a bold solution, striking Argentine positions from the air, despite the island's extreme distance. The Vulcan bombers, once destined for retirement, found themselves thrust into a new role. Engineers and aircrews faced an urgent task, modifying the Cold War-era planes for this improbable mission. At RAF Waddington, technicians worked tirelessly to bring the aging Avro Vulcan bombers back to life. Once the pride of Britain's nuclear deterrent, these aircraft had been on the verge of retirement. Now, they were being hastily retrofitted for a mission they had never been designed for: a 7,800-mile round trip to the Falklands and back. The modifications were extensive. Engineers installed additional fuel tanks, updated navigation systems, and configured the bomb bay to carry conventional weapons instead of nuclear payloads. Time was short, and the pressure to get the aircraft operational was immense. Maintenance crews worked through the night, driven by a shared sense of purpose. Among the team was Flight Lieutenant Alastair Fraser, a seasoned navigator whose job was to ensure the Vulcan stayed on course during the marathon mission. For him, the challenge was exhilarating yet daunting. "If this doesn't work," he confided to a colleague, "we might not come back." The pilots, too, underwent grueling preparations. Practicing low-level flights over British terrain, they sharpened the skills that would be crucial for evading Argentine radar. As the mission date approached, the tension in the hangars was palpable. Each step brought them closer to the unknown. The operation's success hinged on a complex and unprecedented plan. The Vulcan bombers, based on Ascension Island, would need to be refueled mid-air multiple times to reach the Falklands. This required a fleet of Victor tanker aircraft, each refueling both the Vulcans and each other in a delicate chain of coordination. Group Captain Jeremy Price, overseeing the mission's logistics, was painfully aware of the stakes. One misstep in the refueling choreography could jeopardize not just the mission but the lives of the aircrews. "It's like threading a needle in a storm," he explained during a briefing. Pilots and navigators spent hours poring over maps and weather reports. They studied the positions of Argentine radar installations and anti-aircraft batteries. The risks were enormous. Even with the best planning, the outcome remained uncertain. As the crews prepared, letters were written home, goodbyes were whispered, and silent prayers were offered. The moment of truth was near. April 30th, 1982. The airfield at Ascension Island hummed with activity. Ground crews performed final checks on the Vulcan bombers, their sleek silhouettes glinting under the dim floodlights. The roar of the engines shattered the island's stillness as the first aircraft taxied to the runway. Squadron leader Martin Withers, piloting Vulcan XM607, knew the weight of history rested on their shoulders. As the bomber lifted off into the dark, the crew fell into their practiced rhythm, each man focused on his role. Ahead lay hours of flight over empty ocean, with no room for error. In the Victor tankers, the refueling crews braced for the intricate ballet to come. Flying in formation at 30,000 feet, they maneuvered to transfer fuel, each connection a testament to their skill and precision. Radio chatter filled the cabins as fuel calculations were double-checked and weather updates were relayed. As dawn broke over the South Atlantic, the islands came into view, a speck on the horizon. The Vulcan descended to its attack altitude, the crew steeling themselves for the final approach. The mission's climax was at hand. As Vulcan XM607 descended into the attack zone, the crew fell silent, each man focused on his task. Below, the Falkland Islands stretched out like a map, their rugged terrain illuminated by the rising sun. Argentine forces, unaware of the approaching bomber, went about their morning routines. The Vulcan carried 21 1,000-pound bombs, arranged to maximize damage to the runway at Port Stanley's airfield. A functional runway was crucial for the Argentine defense, allowing reinforcements and supplies to flow in. Crippling it could turn the tide of the conflict. Squadron leader Withers held steady at low altitude as the bombardier, Flight Lieutenant Gordon Graham, made final calculations. "Bomb doors open," came the calm voice over the intercom. Seconds stretched into eternity as the payload released, falling in a deadly arc toward the Earth. The sound of explosions echoed across the island as bombs struck the target. Dust and smoke engulfed the airfield. Though only one bomb directly cratered the runway, the others caused significant damage to surrounding facilities. The Vulcan climbed away, its mission complete. Relief washed over the crew as the Vulcan climbed back to altitude. But the mission was far from over. The long return to Ascension required precise fuel management and multiple aerial refuelings. Each Victor tanker had been carefully positioned to ensure the bomber's survival. The first rendezvous was tense. Turbulence buffeted both aircraft as they lined up for the transfer. Fuel flowed steadily, but the delicate operation required both pilots to hold perfect formation for minutes at a time. Every drop of fuel was vital, and any disruption could leave the Vulcan stranded over the ocean. Flight engineer Dave Henzel kept a watchful eye on the gauges, mentally calculating how far they could go. The crew, fatigued but determined, operated with military precision. As the final Victor completed its refueling, the distant outline of Ascension Island came into view. When the Vulcan touched down, it was greeted with cheers from the ground crews. The success of Black Buck 1 was a morale boost for Britain and a stark warning to Argentina: the Royal Air Force could strike anywhere. In the aftermath of the mission, both successes and shortcomings were analyzed. While the bombing had achieved its primary goal of damaging the runway, the operation underscored the challenges of long-range strikes. The logistics were so demanding that every sortie required hundreds of personnel and meticulous planning. Debriefings at RAF Ascension Island highlighted the bravery of the air crews and the ingenuity of the support teams. Yet they also revealed the strain such missions placed on both men and machines. Engineers scrambled to address issues that had arisen during the flight, from minor technical faults to fuel transfer inefficiencies. Meanwhile, in Argentina, military leaders reassessed their strategies. The runway at Port Stanley, though damaged, remained operational for smaller aircraft. Repairs began almost immediately, forcing Britain to consider additional strikes. As plans for the next Black Buck mission were drawn up, the air crews knew their work was far from over. The Falklands War raged on, and the skies over the South Atlantic remained a battleground. Just days after the first strike, plans for Black Buck 2 were set in motion. This time, the focus shifted from the airfield to Argentine radar installations. These systems allowed Argentina to track British aircraft and ships, posing a significant threat to the ongoing naval and air operations. The mission profile mirrored the first, with Vulcan bombers flying from Ascension and refueled mid-air by Victor tankers. However, this strike carried a different payload: anti-radar missiles designed to home in on the emissions of Argentine radar sites. Squadron leader John Reeve led the mission aboard Vulcan XM598. The crew's goal was clear: disable the radar and blind Argentina's forces. As the bomber neared its target, the radar warning receiver crackled to life, signaling detection by Argentine defenses. The crew remained calm, tracking the radar's position and launching the missile. A brilliant flash illuminated the sky as the missile found its mark. Argentine radar operators scrambled to assess the damage, but the attack had achieved its goal. British forces gained a temporary advantage, buying time for naval units advancing toward the islands. Black Buck 2 demonstrated the RAF's ability to strike specific tactical targets, but it came at a price. The Vulcan's return leg encountered complications when mechanical issues forced squadron leader Reeve to divert to Brazil. The unplanned landing risked exposing the mission's details to a neutral country. In Rio de Janeiro, the aircraft and crew were held for questioning. Diplomacy played a critical role in resolving the situation, as British officials worked tirelessly to secure their release. Eventually, the Vulcan and its crew were allowed to return to Ascension, but the incident underscored the risks of such long-range missions. For the crew, the diversion added hours to an already exhausting mission. They returned to Ascension weary but proud of their success. The airmen joked about their brief visit to Brazil, but the tension of the experience lingered in their minds. The third mission, Black Buck 3, began with high hopes but ended in frustration. As the Vulcan climbed to altitude after takeoff, a critical fuel leak was detected. The aircraft was forced to turn back to Ascension before reaching its target. The failure was a blow to morale. Crews and ground personnel had poured their energy into preparing the mission, only to see it aborted. For squadron leader Kevin Gilchrist, the pilot of the Vulcan, the decision to return was painful but necessary. Safety always comes first, he reminded his crew as they debriefed. Despite the setback, lessons were learned. Maintenance teams worked to address the fuel system issue, ensuring it wouldn't jeopardize future missions. The determination to carry on was evident in every member of the team, from engineers to pilots. By now, the Falklands War had intensified. British naval forces faced relentless attacks from Argentine aircraft, while ground troops prepared for amphibious landings. The need for continued air support grew urgent. Operation Black Buck evolved in response to these changing conditions. Intelligence reports suggested Argentina was repairing the Port Stanley runway faster than anticipated. British commanders debated whether additional strikes could permanently neutralize the threat. At RAF Ascension Island, the mood was a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Crews shared stories of their families back home, letters exchanged in the quiet hours between missions. Despite the strain, they understood the stakes. The outcome of the war, and the safety of their comrades, depended on their efforts. The fourth mission, Black Buck 4, aimed once more at the Port Stanley airfield. Intelligence indicated that Argentine engineers were making progress on runway repairs, potentially enabling the operation of fighter jets. The RAF launched another Vulcan strike to disrupt their efforts. This mission saw squadron leader Neil McDougall piloting Vulcan XM-597. As the bomber approached its target, the crew encountered stronger resistance. Argentine radar detected the Vulcan earlier than expected, and anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. Descending to its attack altitude, the Vulcan released its payload. The bombs spread across the airfield, adding fresh craters to the partially repaired runway. The strike disrupted the Argentine efforts, but at the cost of heightened enemy alertness. The return flight was tense, with radar operators reporting potential interceptors. However, the Vulcan evaded detection and made it back to Ascension safely. By the time of Black Buck 4, the strain of the missions was taking its toll on the air crews and ground personnel. Pilots wrestled with the physical and mental exhaustion of flying over 15 hours in a single sortie, while engineers worked tirelessly to keep the aging Vulcans operational. Squadron leader Martin Withers, reflecting on the missions, described the camaraderie that kept them going. Every time we touched down, the ground crew would cheer. They knew how hard it was up there, and we knew how hard they worked to get us in the air. Families back home were another source of strength and worry. Letters arrived sporadically, often weeks old, but they offered glimpses of normal life and a reminder of why they fought. Each mission carried the unspoken fear that it might be their last. The fifth mission, Black Buck 5, shifted its focus to Argentine supplied dumps and troop encampments near Port Stanley. Intelligence reports revealed that Argentina was stockpiling fuel and ammunition, critical for sustaining their defenses. This mission introduced a new weapon to the Vulcan's arsenal, cluster bombs. These were designed to scatter smaller explosives over a wide area, ideal for targeting supply depots. Squadron leader John Reed piloted the mission, knowing the risks of flying over well-defended territory. As the Vulcan approached its target, Argentine anti-aircraft fire intensified. The crew executed evasive maneuvers while releasing the cluster bombs. Explosions rippled across the enemy positions, setting fire to fuel stores and destroying supplies. Though the mission was successful, the increased resistance signaled that future strikes would only grow more dangerous. With 5 missions completed, Operation Black Buck had delivered significant blows to Argentine capabilities. The strikes kept their forces on edge, forcing them to allocate resources to air defense and runway repairs rather than reinforcing their front lines. However, the British commanders faced hard questions. Each mission required immense effort and risked the lives of air crews. Was the impact worth the cost? For the air crews, the answer was clear. They saw their missions as vital to the war effort, a way to protect their comrades fighting on the ground and at sea. As preparations for Black Buck 6 began, the RAF resolved to push forward, determined to see the campaign through. The sixth mission, Black Buck 6, targeted Argentine radar installations once again. By this stage of the campaign, the stakes were higher than ever. Argentine forces had adapted their defenses, making each mission increasingly perilous. Piloted by squadron leader Neil McDougall aboard Vulcan XM-597, the mission carried anti-radar missiles intended to disable key radar sites. As the bomber approached its target, Argentine operators detected the incoming threat and scrambled their anti-aircraft defenses. Bright tracer rounds streaked into the night sky, forcing McDougall to perform evasive maneuvers. The crew managed to fire their missiles, disabling the radar site. However, during the escape, a critical issue arose. A fuel transfer failure left the Vulcan dangerously low on fuel. McDougall made the difficult decision to divert to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The crew executed an emergency landing, and though the aircraft and crew were detained briefly, they were ultimately released, bringing the mission to a dramatic close. Black Buck 7 marked the final mission of the operation. This strike focused on suppressing Argentine air defenses and troop positions around Port Stanley. The culmination of the RAF's daring campaign, it was both a test of endurance and a final show of strength. The mission went smoothly, with Vulcan XM-607 once again taking to the skies under squadron leader Martin Withers. The crew executed their bombing run with precision, targeting troop encampments and ammunition depots. Argentine anti-aircraft fire, though present, was less intense than in earlier missions, a testament to the RAF's relentless campaign. As the Vulcan climbed back to altitude for its long journey home, a sense of closure settled over the crew. They had completed what many thought impossible, delivering 7 long-range strikes against an enemy thousands of miles away. The journey home was somber yet triumphant, marking the end of Operation Black Buck. With the completion of Black Buck 7, the RAF turned its attention to evaluating the operation's overall impact. The missions had disrupted Argentine plans, damaged critical infrastructure, and demonstrated Britain's resolve to defend its territories. For the air crews, the experience was unforgettable. Squadron leader Martin Withers later reflected, "We were ordinary men called upon to do extraordinary things." Black Buck was as much about the people as the planes. The missions were not without controversy. Critics questioned the resource-intensive nature of the strikes and their long-term effectiveness. Supporters, however, argued that the psychological impact on the Argentine forces was immeasurable, forcing them to divert resources and rethink their strategy. As the Falklands War progressed, British ground forces launched their land campaign, pushing Argentine troops back toward Port Stanley. The success of Black Buck and other operations had softened the enemy's defenses, paving the way for the amphibious assault. The stories of the RAF crews spread among the task force, inspiring soldiers and sailors alike. The daring nature of the missions symbolized Britain's determination to reclaim the islands. By June 1982, the war neared its conclusion, with Argentine forces surrendering at Port Stanley. The story of Exercise Purple Warrior. November 1987. The cold winds swept across the rugged coastlines of southwestern Scotland, carrying the whispers of a war that had ended 5 years prior but still cast a long shadow over military strategy. In the aftermath of the Falklands War, Britain sought answers: how to fight smarter, faster, and with precision in remote and unpredictable environments. Exercise Purple Warrior was born from these lessons, a simulation designed to recreate the chaos of war without spilling blood. On a gray, overcast morning, convoys of military trucks snaked out from Colchester. Soldiers, their faces etched with focus, were briefed on their mission: to simulate an amphibious assault and seize a key location held by enemy forces. For many, it was their first taste of such an operation, even if it was a rehearsal. The stage was set, with Scotland's barren hills and rocky beaches standing in for faraway battlefields. Amid the meticulous planning and rehearsals, whispers circulated among the ranks. Veterans who had fought in the Falklands shared stories of the cold, the fear, and the harsh reality of war. Young recruits listened, some with awe, others with unease. The exercise wasn't just about tactics, it was about facing the ghosts of conflicts past. The participants were not alone. Observers from 20 nations, including 12 from Warsaw-Pact countries, were invited to watch the proceedings. Cameras clicked and pens scribbled as they took in every detail. For Britain, this was more than a test, it was a message to allies and adversaries alike. A display of readiness, of strength, and of lessons learned from hard-won victories. The coastal winds howled, and the soldiers braced for what lay ahead. The first chapter of Exercise Purple Warrior was about to unfold. The night before departure, Colchester buzzed with activity. Soldiers prepared their gear, boots polished to a mirror sheen, rifles cleaned and inspected. In the barracks, tension hung thick as commanding officers paced, briefing their units one last time. The plan was ambitious: transport troops to Harwich docks, embark them onto a flotilla, and execute beach landings on Scotland's western coast. Every detail had been planned, yet uncertainty lingered. By dawn, the convoy rolled out, a steady stream of military vehicles stretching as far as the eye could see. Along the route, civilians paused to watch, some waving, others simply observing in silence. The soldiers' faces were a mix of determination and unease, their thoughts straying to the unknown challenges ahead. Harwich docks were a hive of coordinated chaos. Soldiers disembarked and moved in precision to their assigned vessels. Among them was HMS Illustrious, a towering aircraft carrier brimming with activity. Its deck was a symphony of machinery and personnel as helicopters of 845 and 846 Naval Air Squadrons were prepared for action. As the flotilla left the harbor, the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow on the water. The soldiers, now aboard, found themselves with time to reflect. Some wrote letters home, others swapped stories or stared out at the horizon. The journey to Scotland had begun, and with it, the first step toward a trial that would test their mettle. The flotilla reached the Scottish coast under a shroud of mist. The soldiers disembarked onto the cold, rocky beaches, their boots sinking into wet sand. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was interrupted only by the distant rumble of vehicles being unloaded. The operation had begun in earnest. RAF West Frey served as the heart of the exercise, representing a vital strategic target. It was here that the Orange Force, the defenders, awaited. Tasked with holding the base, they had spent days fortifying their positions, setting up mock defenses, and planning countermeasures against the advancing Blue Force. The defenders knew every hill, gully, and forest, turning the landscape into a maze of potential ambushes. For the Blue Force, the terrain was unfamiliar and unforgiving. The soldiers, weighed down by their equipment, trudged through boggy fields and dense woodlands. Morale wavered as fatigue set in, but the officers kept them moving, issuing commands with an air of confidence. Above them, RAF squadrons roared into the sky, simulating air support and reconnaissance missions. As night fell, the tension thickened. The soldiers huddled in their makeshift camps, their breath visible in the frigid air. Somewhere in the distance, the Orange Force lay in wait, ready to repel the coming assault. The first clashes were imminent. The stillness of the pre-dawn hours was broken by the distant thrum of engines. Blue Force had begun their advance. Soldiers moved cautiously, keeping low as they crossed open fields. Ahead lay the first line of Orange Force defenses, a hastily constructed barrier of sandbags and concertina wire. In the dim light, the defenders' silhouettes moved between cover, their presence a constant reminder of the challenge ahead. Suddenly, the silence shattered. Flashes of light erupted as simulated gunfire cracked through the air. Orange Force had opened fire, testing the resolve and strategy of their adversaries. Blue Force soldiers scrambled for cover, their training kicking in as they returned fire. Smoke grenades hissed, creating a swirling fog that obscured the battlefield and heightened the chaos. From the command post, Lieutenant Colonel James Archer, leading the Blue Force, monitored the operation closely. His voice was calm yet commanding as he issued orders through his radio. Nearby, Captain Sarah Blake coordinated the logistics, ensuring that reinforcements and supplies were dispatched where needed. Both officers knew the exercise was about more than winning, it was about identifying weaknesses and learning from mistakes. The first skirmish ended as quickly as it began. Blue Force had breached the initial defenses but at a cost. Soldiers regrouped, their faces smeared with mud and exhaustion. For many, it was their first taste of simulated combat, and though the bullets weren't real, the pressure and adrenaline were. The battle for West Frey was far from over. While Blue Force regrouped, the Orange Force prepared for the next wave. Major Alan Redford, commanding the defending troops, walked the perimeter of their positions, inspecting the fortifications and boosting morale. His men, though outnumbered, were determined to hold their ground. They knew the terrain well and used it to their advantage, setting traps and reinforcing choke points. In a nearby bunker, Sergeant Fiona Caldwell adjusted the communications equipment, her fingers flying over dials and switches. Through her headset, she relayed critical updates to Redford and the forward positions. The defenders' strategy hinged on coordination and discipline, and Caldwell's role was vital. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The defenders huddled in their positions, their breath fogging the air. They shared quiet conversations, their voices laced with a mix of tension and camaraderie. For many, this exercise was an opportunity to prove their mettle, to show they could stand firm under pressure. Above them, the skies buzzed with the sound of RAF squadrons conducting reconnaissance missions. Occasionally, the distant rumble of Blue Force vehicles reached their ears, a reminder that the enemy was on the move. The defenders waited, knowing the next clash was only a matter of time. Dawn broke with an icy chill as Blue Force advanced deeper into the Scottish countryside. The terrain grew more treacherous, thick forests and rocky outcroppings offered natural cover for Orange Force, turning every step into a potential ambush. Lieutenant Colonel Archer gathered his officers around a tactical map, outlining the next phase of the operation. The goal was clear: encircle West Frey and cut off the defender supply lines. Captain Blake oversaw the logistics as armored vehicles moved cautiously along narrow trails. Supplies were meticulously distributed to ensure the advancing troops remained equipped. Meanwhile, reconnaissance teams worked tirelessly to identify Orange Force positions, feeding crucial intelligence back to the command post. Unbeknownst to the advancing forces, Orange Force had anticipated the maneuver. Major Redford ordered his troops to execute a strategic retreat, luring Blue Force into a carefully planned trap. Booby traps were concealed along key routes, and defensive positions were set up just beyond the reach of Blue Force scouts. As the day wore on, Blue Force pushed forward, unaware of the danger ahead. The tension was palpable, each soldier scanning the horizon for signs of movement. When the first explosion rocked the column, chaos erupted. A supply truck was disabled, and soldiers scrambled for cover as simulated artillery fire rained down. The trap had sprung. Smoke hung heavy in the air as Blue Force scrambled to regroup. Communication lines were overwhelmed with frantic reports of casualties and confusion. Lieutenant Colonel Archer maintained his composure, issuing orders to re-establish control. "We move forward," he commanded. "If we stop now, we're done." On the ground, Private William Hayes and his unit pressed forward through the chaos. The young recruit, barely out of training, felt the weight of his rifle like never before. Around him, the simulated battle raged, a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and explosions. Despite the fear clawing at his chest, Hayes focused on the commands of his sergeant, determined to prove himself. Meanwhile, Orange Force capitalized on the confusion. Hidden in the dense underbrush, small squads launched hit-and-run attacks, vanishing before Blue Force could retaliate. Sergeant Caldwell coordinated the efforts, her calm voice guiding the defenders with precision. "Fall back to secondary positions," she ordered, ensuring her troops remained one step ahead of the advancing enemy. As night fell, the battlefield grew eerily quiet. Both sides took stock of their positions, tending to the wounded and preparing for the next phase. The day's events had shifted the momentum, and the outcome of the exercise now hung in the balance. By morning, the mood within Blue Force was grim but resolute. The previous day's ambush had taken its toll, but the troops were determined to press on. Lieutenant Colonel Archer called an emergency briefing, emphasizing the importance of adaptability. "This isn't just a battle of strength," he said. "It's a battle of minds." The troops adjusted their approach, employing smaller, more flexible units to counter Orange Force's guerrilla tactics. These units moved swiftly through the terrain, relying on stealth and coordination to outmaneuver the defenders. For Private Hayes, the shift brought a sense of purpose. "We're not just reacting anymore," he confided to a fellow soldier. "We're fighting back." Within Orange Force, the mood was similarly intense. Major Redford praised his troops for their resilience but warned against complacency. "They'll adapt," he cautioned. "And so must we." The defenders reinforced their final line of defense at West Frey, preparing for a decisive confrontation. As the sun set on another day, both sides braced for what was to come. The exercise had evolved into a grueling test of endurance and strategy, and the lessons being learned would shape future operations. The battle for West Frey was far from over. At the edge of the battlefield, a group of international observers watched the unfolding drama with rapt attention. Representatives from 20 nations, including 12 from Warsaw Pact countries, stood together, their binoculars fixed on the action. This was no ordinary exercise, it was a demonstration of Britain's military prowess and strategic evolution. Every detail was scrutinized, every maneuver analyzed. Colonel Viktor Orlov from the Soviet delegation observed with a calculated gaze. Though outwardly neutral, he took meticulous notes on Blue Force's tactics and adaptability. "They've learned much from their past conflicts," he remarked to his aide. "But let's see how they handle sustained resistance." Nearby, Major Alice Turner from the United States spoke into a recording device, providing commentary for her superiors back home. "Their use of combined arms is impressive," she noted. "The integration of air support with ground units shows a clear effort to refine their approach since the Falklands." The observers' gallery was not merely a passive audience. Diplomats and analysts exchanged quiet remarks, their interest in the exercise rooted in broader geopolitical implications. For Britain, this was not just a test of military skill, it was a calculated message to allies and adversaries alike. As the day wore on, the observers continued to monitor the battlefield. Each clash between Blue and Orange forces provided new insights into modern warfare. For them, Exercise Purple Warrior was more than a simulation, it was a glimpse into the future of conflict. Under the cover of darkness, Blue Force prepared for the final assault on West Frey. The air was tense, the soldiers' breaths visible in the frigid night. Orders were whispered, gear checked, and strategies finalized. The objective was clear: breach the final defenses and seize the base. Captain Sarah Blake led one of the assault teams, her voice steady as she briefed her squad. Precision is key, she reminded them. Stick to the plan, cover your sectors, and we'll make it through. The team moved out, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Orange Force, entrenched within West Frey, awaited the onslaught. Major Redford stood at the command post, his eyes scanning the map for any sign of weakness in their defenses. His troops had fortified the base with simulated minefields, barricades, and overlapping fields of fire. Hold your ground, he told them. Make them fight for every inch. The assault began with a deafening barrage. Blue Force unleashed smoke grenades to obscure their movements as they advanced under heavy cover. The defenders responded with a coordinated volley, their positions erupting with simulated gunfire. The battle for West Frey had begun in earnest. Amid the chaos, Private Hayes found himself in the thick of the action. His squad pushed forward, clearing trenches and neutralizing defensive positions. Every step was hard-fought, every victory earned through grit and determination. The once quiet fields of Scotland were now alive with the sounds of battle. As dawn broke over West Frey, the exercise reached its conclusion. Both forces were called to a ceasefire, their commanders instructed to assemble for debriefing. The battlefield, now littered with spent cartridges and smoke canisters, bore the scars of the simulated war. For Blue Force, the operation was a bittersweet victory. They had captured West Frey but at a high cost in simulated losses. Lieutenant Colonel Archer addressed his troops with pride and candor. "We succeeded because we adapted," he said. "But we also learned where we fell short. And that is the true measure of this exercise." Orange Force, despite their defeat, held their heads high. Major Redford commended his troops for their tenacity and ingenuity. "You showed them what it means to defend with determination," he said. "We may have lost the base, but we proved our mettle." The observers gathered for a formal review, offering their insights and evaluations. Colonel Orloff, impressed by the exercise's scope, remarked, "It was a worthy demonstration. Their lessons from the Falklands are evident." Major Turner added, "This was not just about winning or losing, it was about evolution." As the soldiers packed up and prepared to leave, a sense of accomplishment pervaded the air. Exercise Purple Warrior had achieved its goal, testing strategies, building resilience, and preparing for the future. The lessons learned here would ripple through military doctrine for years to come. The story of Operation Modula. In the unforgiving terrain of southern Angola, where the dry winds carried whispers of conflict, a pivotal battle brewed under the searing African sun. It was 1987, and the Angolan Civil War raged on, intertwining with the broader South African border war. As global superpowers cast long shadows over the region, local forces clashed in a struggle that would define their future. In the midst of this chaos, Operation Modular emerged, a meticulously planned South African Defence Force, SADF, campaign to halt the Angolan government's advance on Mavinga. It was a battle of strategy and survival, fought in the dusty plains and dense jungles of Angola, where every decision could change the course of history. Angola, a land of stunning contrasts, had become a battlefield. For over a decade, it was torn apart by a civil war that had begun with its hard-fought independence from Portuguese rule. On one side was the People's Armed Forces for the Liberation of Angola, FAPLA, backed by Cuban troops and Soviet advisors. Their mission was to secure the nation under the rule of the Marxist-Leninist MPLA government. Opposing them stood UNITA, a rebel movement supported by South Africa and the United States, whose fighters sought to establish their vision of a free Angola. By mid-1987, FAPLA's ambitions turned to Mavinga, a key stronghold for UNITA. Capturing it would cut off the rebel movement from its logistical lifeline, effectively crippling their resistance. The South African government, fearing the spread of Soviet influence, could not stand idly by. Operation Modular was born, its objectives clear: halt FAPLA's advance and inflict a blow so devastating that the enemy would think twice before attempting another offensive. As the SADF mobilized for Operation Modular, soldiers prepared themselves for the grueling campaign ahead. Among them was Major Johann Pretorius, a seasoned officer whose tactical mind would be tested like never before. For Pretorius, this was not merely another mission, it was a clash of ideologies, a battle to prevent what he saw as a domino effect of communism creeping closer to South Africa's borders. Meanwhile, FAPLA forces amassed on the banks of the Lomba River, their ranks bolstered by Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery. General Roberto Leitão, a staunch MPLA loyalist, commanded these forces with confidence. His orders were simple: push southward, cross the river, and take Mavinga. As Cuban and Soviet advisors fine-tuned FAPLA's strategy, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. In the shadows, UNITA fighters sharpened their weapons and steeled themselves for the defense of their homeland. Led by Jonas Savimbi, their charismatic and polarizing leader, they knew their survival depended on holding Mavinga at all costs. By late August, the first skirmishes erupted along the Lomba River. FAPLA's 47th Brigade, spearheading the offensive, clashed with UNITA scouts. The dense foliage became a theater of ambushes and counterattacks. Reports of the fighting reached SADF headquarters, where Colonel Dion Ferreira, the operations commander, assessed the situation. Ferreira understood that defeating FAPLA required more than brute force. He devised a plan to draw the enemy deeper into UNITA-held territory, away from their supply lines. SADF armored columns and artillery units began to deploy near Mavinga, their camouflage blending seamlessly with the arid landscape. The Lomba became a river of blood, its waters tinged with the sacrifices of young soldiers on both sides. For those who survived, the haunting cries of their fallen comrades would echo in their minds long after the battle was over. As September unfolded, the SADF intensified its operations. Under the cover of darkness, they established forward bases and reconnaissance posts near the Lomba River. The soldiers, hardened by the realities of the border war, were a mix of veterans and young recruits. Among them was Corporal Peter van der Merwe, a farm boy from the Northern Cape. This was his first operation, and though his exterior was calm, his heart raced at the thought of facing FAPLA's Soviet-made tanks. Across the river, FAPLA forces pressed on, unaware of the trap being set. The 47th Brigade, confident in their numerical and technological superiority, began constructing pontoon bridges to move heavy armor. Yet, delays and technical mishaps slowed their progress, frustrating General Leitão. For every day they lingered on the riverbanks, the SADF grew bolder, their ambushes harassing the Angolan forces and forcing them to expend precious resources. On the night of September 12, the SADF launched its first major counteroffensive. Artillery shells lit up the sky as South African G5 howitzers rained fire on FAPLA positions. The ground trembled under the thunderous assault. For hours, chaos reigned, and when the dust settled, dozens of FAPLA vehicles lay in ruins. The 47th Brigade, though battered, was not broken. While FAPLA regrouped, SADF command shifted gears. Operation Modular was no longer a defensive mission, it became a calculated campaign of attrition. Colonel Ferreira dispatched small, mobile units deep into enemy territory. These phantom forces were tasked with targeting supply lines and sowing confusion among FAPLA ranks. Among these units was a team led by Captain Andrew Jacobs, an experienced officer whose calm demeanor masked an unshakable resolve. His team of 12 men, accompanied by UNITA guides, traversed the unforgiving bush. They relied on stealth and precision, striking swiftly before vanishing into the shadows. One fateful night, Jacobs' team ambushed a FAPLA convoy transporting fuel and ammunition. The explosion from their attack illuminated the dark landscape, the flames dancing like phantoms against the night sky. For FAPLA soldiers who survived, it was a harrowing reminder of their enemy's reach. Jacobs' team returned to base unscathed, their morale high. Yet, the psychological toll of their missions was undeniable. Each man carried the weight of lives taken, their laughter around the campfire masking the burden of war. By late September, the momentum shifted. FAPLA's 47th Brigade, demoralized and depleted, faced a stark reality: they were losing ground. Supplies dwindled, and desertions began to rise. General Ladau, under pressure from his Soviet advisors, ordered an all-out push to cross the Lomba River. The goal was simple: break through UNITA and SADF defenses before reinforcements could arrive. For the SADF, this was an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. Colonel Ferreira devised a plan to encircle the advancing forces. Using the natural choke points along the river, the SADF created a killing zone. Mines were laid, and ambush positions fortified. On October 3rd, the two forces collided in one of the most intense battles of the campaign. Tanks roared to life, and machine guns spewed fire as the jungle erupted in violence. The SADF's Radel infantry vehicles proved invaluable, their mobility allowing them to outflank the heavier FAPLA armor. The 47th Brigade, caught in the trap, suffered devastating losses. By nightfall, the battlefield was littered with smoldering wreckage and the fallen. FAPLA survivors retreated across the river, their dreams of seizing Mavinga shattered. For the SADF, it was a hard-earned victory, but the war was far from over. With the 47th Brigade neutralized, attention turned to FAPLA's remaining forces. The road to Cuidaquanavale, a strategic stronghold, lay ahead. Both sides prepared for the next phase of the campaign. In the SADF camp, spirits were high but tempered by the reality of their mission. Major Pretorius gathered his officers, outlining plans for the next offensive. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah van Niekerk, one of the few female intelligence officers in the field. Her keen mind and fluency in Portuguese made her invaluable in decoding intercepted communications. Meanwhile, FAPLA reinforced its positions near Quito. Cuban soldiers bolstered their ranks, bringing with them expertise and resolve. Commanders devised a strategy to hold the town at all costs, knowing its fall would be a catastrophic blow to the MPLA's war effort. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the future of the region. As the dry season gave way to the rains, soldiers on both sides braced themselves for the trials to come. The rains arrived in Angola, transforming the once dusty terrain into a quagmire. For FAPLA, the weather offered a glimmer of hope. The swollen rivers and sodden ground would slow SADF advances, giving the defenders time to fortify Cuidaquanavale. The town, nestled near the confluence of the Cuita and Quanavale rivers, had become a linchpin in the Angolan civil war. Inside the FAPLA headquarters, General Ladau and his Cuban allies planned their next moves. Engineers worked tirelessly to construct defenses, trenches, minefields, and artillery placements that would turn Quito into a fortress. Cuban Colonel Pedro Rodriguez, a veteran of multiple campaigns, took charge of coordinating the town's defense. His men, battle-hardened and well-disciplined, brought a sense of professionalism that FAPLA troops sorely lacked. Across the lines, the SADF and UNITA forces refined their strategy. Colonel Ferreira knew that a direct assault on Quito would be suicidal. Instead, he proposed a systematic campaign to cut off the town from its supply lines, starving it into submission. In this effort, the SADF's mobility and superior logistics would prove critical. The battle lines were drawn, and both sides braced for a prolonged and grueling confrontation. The skies over Angola became a battleground as the SADF sought to assert control over the air. South African pilots, flying French-made Mirage F-1s, engaged in dogfights with Cuban MiG-23s. These aerial duels were fast and deadly, with split-second decisions determining life and death. Captain Mark Visser, a Mirage pilot, had earned a reputation as a daring and resourceful aviator. On October 18, he found himself in the crosshairs of two Cuban MiGs. Using the Mirage's agility and his own skill, Visser executed a series of maneuvers that not only evaded his pursuers but also allowed him to destroy one of the enemy jets. His victory was celebrated in the SADF camp, though Visser remained humble, haunted by the face of the Cuban pilot he had seen eject moments before the explosion. Air superiority was not just about combat, it was also about logistics. SADF transport planes flew vital supplies to forward bases, dodging enemy anti-aircraft fire. Helicopters ferried wounded soldiers to field hospitals, their rotors beating a lifeline into the conflict zone. For FAPLA, the loss of aerial dominance was a severe blow. Their supply convoys, already vulnerable to SADF ground attacks, became easy targets for strafing runs. By November, the SADF had effectively isolated Quito Cuanavale. Supply lines were severed, and morale among FAPLA troops began to waver. Yet, the defenders held firm, their resolve bolstered by Cuban reinforcements and promises of Soviet support. Lieutenant Sarah Van Niekerk's intelligence work proved invaluable during this phase. Intercepted communications revealed FAPLA's desperate calls for resupply and reinforcements. Her analysis allowed SADF artillery units to target key enemy positions with devastating accuracy. The siege was a test of endurance for both sides. In the SADF camp, soldiers grappled with homesickness and the harsh conditions of the Angolan bush. Corporal Peter van der Merwe, once wide-eyed and eager, now carried the hardened look of a man who had seen too much. Yet, he found solace in camaraderie, the shared bond of those fighting side by side. Inside Quito, the situation grew dire. Food and medical supplies ran low, and the wounded overwhelmed field hospitals. General Ladau faced mounting pressure from his Soviet advisors to break the siege, but every counterattack was met with fierce resistance. On November 9, the SADF launched an operation to seize the Shambinga Heights, a strategic position overlooking Quito Cuanavale. The heights offered a commanding view of the town and its defenses, making it a crucial objective. The attack began with a barrage of artillery fire, softening enemy positions. SADF mechanized infantry, supported by UNITA fighters, advanced under the cover of darkness. Among them was Captain Andrew Jacobs, whose leadership had earned him the respect of his men. The fighting on the Shambinga Heights was brutal and close quarters. FAPLA defenders, entrenched and desperate, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. For hours, the battle raged, with neither side willing to yield. At dawn, the SADF finally secured the heights. The victory came at a heavy cost, with significant casualties on both sides. For the survivors, the sight of Cuidaquanavale in the distance served as a stark reminder of the challenges that still lay ahead. Cuidaquanavale, once a bustling town surrounded by the lush Angolan savanna, had become a city under siege. The sounds of war echoed through its streets, the rumble of distant artillery, the roar of jets streaking overhead, and the anguished cries of the wounded. For the FAPLA soldiers and their Cuban allies, the town was a last bastion, a symbol of their determination to resist the advancing SADF. Within the town, General Leitao and Colonel Rodriguez worked tirelessly to maintain morale and order. The Cuban troops brought discipline and experience, but even they were beginning to feel the strain. Food and ammunition supplies were critically low, and every failed resupply effort deepened the defenders' despair. Outside the town, the SADF tightened its grip. Colonel Ferreira's strategy of encirclement left no room for error. The SADF artillery positions, equipped with their powerful G5 howitzers, pounded Cuida day and night, targeting command centers and supply depots with pinpoint accuracy. UNITA fighters, familiar with the terrain, conducted guerrilla raids, cutting off any escape routes. Despite the hardships, the defenders clung to hope. Soviet advisors assured them that reinforcements and heavy weapons were on the way. For now, Cuidaquanavale stood firm, a fortress battered but unbroken. As November deepened, the SADF intensified its operations to disrupt FAPLA's supply chains and reinforcements. Captain Andrew Jacobs and his reconnaissance team were tasked with infiltrating the dense jungle surrounding Cuita to intercept a critical convoy carrying fuel and ammunition. The jungle was a world of its own, humid, teeming with life, and filled with dangers both natural and man-made. Every step was a gamble, with landmines hidden beneath the foliage and enemy patrols lurking nearby. Jacob's team moved silently, their movements synchronized like clockwork. When the convoy finally appeared, it was escorted by heavily armed FAPLA troops. The team waited until the vehicles reached a narrow bend in the road before springing their ambush. Explosions shattered the stillness as the lead truck was obliterated. Gunfire erupted, a chaotic symphony of survival. The mission was a success, the convoy was destroyed, and the team exfiltrated with minimal casualties. But for Jacobs, the cost of these operations weighed heavily. Each mission took a piece of him, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Within Cuidaquanavale, desperation grew. General Leitao, under immense pressure from Soviet advisors, authorized a bold and risky counteroffensive. The plan was to break through the SAD's encirclement by launching a coordinated tank assault across the Shambinga Heights. On November 20th, FAPLA's armored brigades roared to life. Soviet T-55 tanks, supported by infantry and artillery, began their advance. The SADF, anticipating such a move, had prepared defensive positions along the expected route. Minefields, anti-tank weaponry, and entrenched infantry awaited the attackers. The clash was catastrophic. As FAPLA tanks rolled forward, they encountered a relentless barrage from SADF artillery. Mines exploded beneath their tracks, immobilizing vehicles and sowing panic among the crews. The SAD's Radel anti-tank teams moved swiftly, striking with deadly precision. By the end of the day, the offensive had been repelled. FAPLA's losses were staggering, dozens of tanks destroyed, hundreds of soldiers killed or captured. The failed counteroffensive marked a turning point in the battle, solidifying SAD's dominance. As November drew to a close, the SADF began scaling back its operations. Operation Modular had achieved its primary objectives, halting FAPLA's advance on Mavinga and inflicting devastating losses on the enemy. The road to Cuidaquanavale, while still contested, was firmly under SADF control. For many SADF soldiers, the end of the operation brought a mix of relief and reflection. Corporal Peter van der Merwe, once a naive farm boy, now carried the weight of a soldier who had seen the horrors of war. As he packed his gear for the journey back to South Africa, he thought of the friends he had lost and the scars, both visible and hidden, that he would carry forever. In Cuidaquanavale, the defenders braced themselves for what they knew was an inevitable continuation of the conflict. The town remained a symbol of resistance, its people determined to endure despite the odds. Operation Modular had ended, but the Angolan Civil War and the South African Border War were far from over. The story of Operation Alpha Centauri. August 1986. The vast, rugged terrain of Angola was quiet, deceptively so. The South African Defence Forces, SADF, and their ally, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, prepared for a decisive push. Their target? The strategic stronghold of Cuidaquanavale, a critical node for the opposing people's armed forces for the liberation of Angola, FAPLA. The operation, named Alpha Centauri, promised both opportunity and peril, its outcome poised to tilt the scales of the South African Border War and the Angolan Civil War. As the sun dipped below the horizon on August 9, whispers of strategy and tension filled command posts. Soldiers tightened their bootlaces and adjusted their gear, their thoughts a blend of duty, fear, and resolve. The distant rumble of artillery loomed like a harbinger, marking the start of something monumental. On the eve of August 9, 1986, in the outskirts of Mavinga, South African commanders finalized their plans. Colonel Jan Swart, a seasoned officer, studied a sprawling map under a dim lamp. His voice, steady yet laden with the weight of responsibility, outlined the mission to a room of attentive faces. The plan was audacious: deploy heavy artillery and strike Cuidaquanavale's defenses, crippling FAPLA's ability to launch counterattacks. The goal was not merely to defeat but to dismantle. Swart emphasized precision and coordination, knowing the operation's success depended on both. In the dense Angolan bush, Sergeant Peter Vermaak sat with his squad, sharing a quiet meal. The air was thick with anticipation. Tomorrow, Vermaak murmured, we make history or become a part of it. His comrades nodded, their faces reflecting the unspoken bond forged in battle. At UNITA's camp, Jonas Savimbi, the charismatic leader, rallied his men. His speech, fiery and impassioned, painted a picture of victory in liberation. Tonight, we fight for our land, for freedom, he proclaimed. The men erupted in cheers, their spirits lifted, even if only momentarily. As the clock struck 17:10 on August 9, 1986, the first salvo roared to life. The thunderous boom of South African artillery shattered the tranquil Angolan evening, shaking the ground for miles around. Precision strikes targeted FAPLA positions near Cuidaquanavale, aiming to disrupt their supply lines and communication hubs. On the front lines, Private Johan Muller, a radio operator, relayed coordinates to the artillery teams. His voice, steady despite the chaos, carried through the static-filled airwaves. Each strike was followed by a deep rumble, the earth trembling under the sheer power of the bombardment. Across enemy lines, FAPLA soldiers scrambled to respond. Captain Luis Miguel, a steadfast Angolan officer, barked orders amidst the cacophony. Hold your positions. Return fire, he shouted, rallying his troops as shells exploded around them. Miguel's mind raced, knowing this was no ordinary skirmish. UNITA forces, equipped and emboldened by South African support, advanced under the cover of artillery fire. Their movements were swift and deliberate, aiming to exploit the confusion sown among FAPLA ranks. Among them, Corporal Paulo Nzinga moved with grim determination, his rifle clutched tightly. For him, this was not just a battle but a chance to reclaim his homeland. By August 10, the conflict had escalated into a full-scale battle. Fapla's defenses, though battered, held firm, forcing SADF and UNITA forces into a deadly game of maneuvering and counterattacks. The battlefield became a mosaic of fire and smoke, each side vying for dominance. In the thick of it, Vermic's squad found themselves pinned down by relentless enemy fire. "Keep low," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. The squad's medic, Corporal David Liu, worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded, his hands steadied despite the chaos. Meanwhile, Fapla's Captain Miguel orchestrated a daring counteroffensive. Using the dense terrain to their advantage, his troops launched surprise attacks on exposed South African positions. The strategy paid off, forcing the SADF to regroup and rethink their approach. In the midst of this, UNITA's Paulo Nzinga found himself face-to-face with the horrors of war. The lifeless eyes of a fallen comrade haunted him as he pressed forward. Yet, his resolve remained unbroken. "For Angola," he whispered, pushing aside his fear. As the battle raged, a critical moment emerged. South African commanders recognized that Fapla's artillery units were the linchpin of their defense. Colonel Swart devised a high-risk plan to neutralize them, calling for a coordinated ground and air assault. On August 12, SAT's mechanized units moved into position, supported by airstrikes from Puma helicopters. The assault was precise and devastating, crippling Fapla's artillery capabilities. Swart watched from his command post, his expression a mix of relief and solemnity. For Captain Miguel, the loss was a bitter blow. He rallied his men for a desperate defense, knowing they were now vulnerable. "We must hold this line, no matter the cost," he urged, his voice firm despite the weight of the situation. Nzinga, now leading a small UNITA unit, seized the opportunity to advance. His group infiltrated a Fapla supply depot, sabotaging ammunition stores and further crippling the enemy's efforts. The success filled him with a bittersweet pride, tempered by the loss of friends along the way. By August 13, the toll of the battle began to weigh heavily on all involved. The once clear objectives of Operation Alpha Centauri were clouded by the growing human cost. Soldiers on both sides found themselves grappling with exhaustion, fear, and the grim reality of war. In the South African camp, Vermic's squad prepared for another grueling day. Over a makeshift fire, they spoke in hushed tones about home, about family. "Do you think they'll remember us?" asked Private Muller, his eyes distant. Vermic placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're fighting for something bigger than ourselves," he said, though his own conviction was beginning to waver. In Fapla's ranks, morale faltered as supplies dwindled. Captain Miguel moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement. "This is our land, our fight," he reminded them, though he knew their resolve was cracking. The weight of leadership bore down on him, but he carried it with quiet dignity. Nzinga and his UNITA comrades continued their advance, moving through dense bush under cover of darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Each step brought them closer to the enemy, and closer to danger. On the night of August 14, the SADF launched a daring offensive, aiming to encircle Cuidaquanavale. Under the cover of darkness, mechanized infantry units advanced alongside UNITA forces. The plan relied on speed and surprise, a calculated gamble in the unforgiving terrain. Vermic's squad was tasked with securing a critical bridge leading to the town. As they approached, the sound of distant gunfire grew louder, merging with the hum of engines. "Eyes open, weapons ready," Vermic whispered. The squad moved with precision, their training guiding them through the chaos. Fapla forces, though battered, mounted a fierce resistance. Miguel, now commanding from the front, directed his troops with unwavering determination. The night was illuminated by tracer rounds and explosions, a surreal tableau of light and shadow. Nzinga's unit found themselves locked in a deadly firefight near the bridge. Amid the chaos, he spotted a young Fapla soldier, barely more than a boy. Their eyes met for a brief moment, a fleeting connection between two adversaries. Then the boy vanished into the darkness, leaving Nzinga with a haunting sense of shared humanity. The dawn of August 15th brought a pivotal moment. After days of relentless fighting, the SADF and UNITA forces succeeded in breaking through Fapla's outer defenses. The road to Cuidaquanavale lay open, but it came at a heavy cost. Colonel Swart stood atop a ridge, surveying the battlefield. The sight was both a triumph and a tragedy. "We've done it," he said softly, though his voice carried no joy. The losses on both sides weighed heavily on him, a stark reminder of the price of victory. For Captain Miguel, the defeat was devastating. His men retreated to secondary positions, their ranks decimated. Still, he refused to surrender. "This is not the end," he told his officers. "We fight on." Vermaak and his squad finally crossed the bridge they had fought so hard to secure. The silence that followed the battle was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. "We made it," said Muller, his voice tinged with disbelief. But the cost was evident in the empty spaces where comrades once stood. The final days of the operation were marked by desperation and determination. With Fapla on the back foot, the SADF and UNITA forces pushed toward Cuidaquanavale. Every inch of ground was contested, every victory hard-won. Nzinga led his unit into the outskirts of the town, where resistance was fierce. The streets were littered with debris, the air thick with smoke. "Stay close," he urged, his voice steady despite the danger. His men followed without question, their trust in him absolute. Inside Cuidaquanavale, Miguel prepared for what he knew would be a final stand. His men fortified their positions, readying themselves for the inevitable assault. "If we fall with honor," he told them, his words a rallying cry. The climax came on August 17, as the SADF launched a coordinated assault on the town. Tanks rolled forward, supported by infantry and airstrikes. The fighting was brutal, a testament to the resolve of both sides. In the end, the town was left in ruins, a stark reminder of the war's destructive power. As the dust settled over Cuidaquanavale on August 17, 1986, the landscape told the story of a battle hard-fought and devastatingly costly. Smoke rose from the remnants of buildings and vehicles, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional crackle of fire. For the soldiers who survived, the reality of what had been endured began to sink in. Vermaak and his squad regrouped near the town's outskirts. The victory felt hollow as they tallied their losses. "We won, didn't we?" asked Private Muller, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. Vermaak nodded slowly. "We did, but at what cost?" The squad shared a somber moment of reflection, their camaraderie strengthened by shared grief. In the ruins of Fapla's positions, Captain Miguel tended to his wounded. Though his forces had been overrun, he refused to let despair take hold. "We live to fight another day," he told his men, his tone resolute. For Miguel, survival was a small victory, a chance to regroup and continue the fight for Angola. Nzinga, now weary but resolute, led his men back to UNITA's camp. The triumph was bittersweet, overshadowed by the memories of fallen comrades. As they rested, He thought of the future, a future where his homeland might one day be free. The days following the operation brought a mix of relief and unease. While the South African and UNITA forces celebrated their strategic victory, the shadow of the war loomed large. For every inch gained, there was a life lost, and the soldiers who returned carried the weight of their experiences. Colonel Swart stood at the edge of the battlefield, gazing at the horizon. The operation had achieved its objectives, yet he felt no sense of closure. War has no true victors, he mused aloud. His words resonated with those around him, a stark acknowledgement of the human cost of their endeavors. In Fapla's remaining strongholds, Miguel prepared for the next phase of the conflict. He knew that the battle for Angola was far from over. His men, though diminished, looked to him for guidance. "We will rebuild, and we will fight again," he assured them, his determination unwavering. For Nzinga, the operation marked a turning point. The scars of war, both physical and emotional, shaped him into a leader his men admired. As he gazed at the Angolan wilderness, he vowed to continue the fight for freedom, even if the path was fraught with peril. In the weeks following the operation, the true cost of Alpha Centauri became evident. Villages near the battlefield bore the scars of the conflict, their inhabitants displaced or grieving for loved ones. The ripple effects of the operation extended far beyond the front lines. Vermic's squad was assigned to assist with humanitarian efforts in the region. The sight of civilians caught in the crossfire was a stark reminder of the war's reach. Among the rubble, they found a young boy clutching a battered photograph. "Where is my father?" he asked, his voice trembling. Vermic knelt down, his heart heavy with the weight of the boy's question. In Quitaquanavale, Miguel worked to restore order amidst the devastation. He coordinated efforts to provide food and medical aid to his men and the civilian population. Though his resources were limited, his resolve was unshaken. "We are stronger than they think," he told his officers, his voice a beacon of hope. Nzinga, too, found himself confronting the aftermath of the operation. As he walked through a destroyed village, he was struck by the resilience of its people. They rebuilt their homes with what little they had, their determination a testament to their strength. "This is what we fight for," he reminded himself, renewed in his purpose. By September 1986, the immediate violence of Operation Alpha Centauri had subsided, but the tension remained. Both sides licked their wounds, regrouping and preparing for what they knew would be the next chapter in the protracted conflict. The battle had ended, but the war raged on. For Vermic, the experience left an indelible mark. He wrote a letter to his wife, recounting the horrors and the camaraderie that kept him going. "This war changes us," he wrote. "But I hope it doesn't take away who we are." Miguel received orders from his superiors to fortify their positions and prepare for future offensives. Though weary, he took solace in the resilience of his men. Together, they stood ready to defend their homeland, no matter the odds. Nzinga returned to his family's village, where he was greeted as a hero. Yet, the celebrations were muted, overshadowed by the memories of those who had been lost. As he sat with his mother under a starlit sky, he spoke of his dreams for a free Angola. "One day, this will all be behind us," he said, though he knew the journey was far from over. In the weeks that followed Operation Alpha Centauri, high-ranking officials on both sides convened to analyze the battle's outcomes. While the SADF considered the operation a strategic success, questions lingered about its long-term impact. Did it bring them closer to their goals, or merely deepen the resolve of their adversaries? In Pretoria, Colonel Swart presented his report to the SADF leadership. He detailed the precision of the artillery bombardments, the successes of the mechanized units, and the bravery of his troops. Yet, he didn't shy away from the challenges. Our enemy is not broken, he concluded. They are wounded, but they will adapt. In Luanda, FAPWA commanders held a similar meeting. Captain Miguel's account of the battle emphasized their resilience despite overwhelming odds. We were outgunned but not defeated, he asserted. His words fueled discussions on restructuring their defenses and seeking stronger support from their allies, including Cuba and the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, UNITA's Jonas Savimbi celebrated the operation as a victory for his movement. Addressing his followers, he declared, "This is proof that Angola's liberation is inevitable." Yet even Savimbi knew that this battle was just one step in a long and uncertain journey. As September wore on, life in and around Cuidaquanavale began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Civilians ventured cautiously from makeshift shelters, their lives forever changed by the violence that had engulfed their homes. Vermic's squad continued their humanitarian efforts, distributing supplies and assisting with reconstruction. One day, they encountered a young girl planting flowers near the ruins of her family's home. "Why flowers?" Vermic asked. The girl looked up and smiled. "Because they remind me of peace." Her simple words stayed with him, a reminder of the hope that could endure even in the darkest times. For Miguel, the task of rebuilding was monumental. His men worked tirelessly to repair roads, restore water supplies, and provide for displaced families. Though exhausted, Miguel found solace in their perseverance. "Every stone we lay is a step toward our future," he told them. Nzinga, too, took on the role of a leader in his community. He organized efforts to rebuild schools and provide shelter for the displaced. Though his heart ached for his fallen comrades, he found purpose in helping his people. "We fight for them," he reminded his men. "And we must also fight to heal." As the months passed, whispers of new offensives spread on both sides. The SADF prepared to consolidate their gains, while FAPWA and their allies strengthened their positions. The specter of renewed conflict loomed large, casting a shadow over the fragile peace. In the South African camp, Vermic's squad received news of fresh reinforcements arriving from home. The soldiers were young, eager, and untested. Vermic took it upon himself to mentor them, sharing hard-earned lessons. "War isn't glory," he told them. "It's survival." In Cuidaquanavale, Miguel received word of Cuban reinforcements arriving to bolster their defenses. The news lifted the spirits of his men, who had grown weary from months of hardship. Miguel knew that their presence would tip the balance, but he also understood the stakes. "With them comes hope," he said, "but also greater challenges." Nzinga learned that UNITA would receive additional supplies from their allies. The promise of new weapons and equipment reinvigorated his unit, though Nzinga cautioned his men against overconfidence. "Victory isn't in the tools," he reminded them. "It's in how we use them." By late 1986, the region braced for the next phase of the war. Soldiers drilled, strategies were refined, and the wounds of Operation Alpha Centauri became part of the landscape, both physical and emotional. Colonel Swart oversaw training exercises, emphasizing adaptability and discipline. "We can't afford to underestimate our enemy," he told his officers. His leadership inspired confidence, even as the challenges ahead remained daunting. Miguel, now a seasoned veteran, worked tirelessly to prepare his men. He knew that their survival depended on unity and determination. "We stand as one," he said during a speech, his words met with cheers of approval. Nzinga, reflecting on the sacrifices made, vowed to honor them by continuing the fight. He spent hours strategizing with his commanders, ensuring that every move they made would bring them closer to their ultimate goal. "We carry the weight of our people," he said, "and we will not falter." As the dry season drew to a close in late 1986, tensions rose across Angola. In the aftermath of Operation Alpha Centauri, the strategic significance of Cuidaquanavale became a rallying cry for both sides. South Africa sought to solidify its gains, while FAPLA, bolstered by Cuban reinforcements, prepared for a counteroffensive. In the South African camp, Vermek's squad received orders to fortify positions near the town. Nights were spent digging trenches and setting up defensive lines under the flickering light of campfires. The air was thick with anticipation, every rustle in the bush a potential threat. "It's too quiet," Private Muller muttered one evening. Vermek agreed but kept his thoughts to himself, unwilling to stoke the growing unease. In Cuidaquanavale, Captain Miguel's preparations were nearly complete. The arrival of Cuban advisors transformed the town into a heavily fortified position. Miguel worked closely with his Cuban counterpart, Colonel Ramirez, whose calm demeanor and wealth of experience brought reassurance to FAPLA's weary soldiers. "We hold the line here," Ramirez stated firmly. "This town will not fall." Nzinga, meanwhile, led reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory. His unit gathered critical intelligence on FAPLA's movements, often under the cover of darkness. One night, as they crept through the jungle, Nzinga paused, his instincts alerting him to an unseen presence. Moments later, the distant sound of a branch snapping confirmed his suspicion: the enemy was near. In early October, the uneasy calm was broken by a sudden clash on the outskirts of Cuidaquanavale. A South African patrol encountered a FAPLA scouting party, and the resulting firefight echoed through the surrounding hills. Though brief, the skirmish signaled the beginning of a renewed struggle for control. Vermek's squad was among the first to respond. As they arrived at the scene, the sight of smoldering vehicles and scattered debris greeted them. "Check for survivors," Vermek ordered, his voice steady despite the tension. The team moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready. FAPLA forces, led by Miguel, quickly mobilized to secure the area. Miguel's sharp eyes scanned the terrain as he issued commands. "Hold the high ground," he instructed, knowing its strategic importance. His men responded with precision, their movements a testament to months of rigorous training. Nzinga, observing the skirmish from a concealed vantage point, noted the strength of FAPLA's response. "They've fortified well," he whispered to his second-in-command. The realization was both daunting and invigorating: the road to victory would be long, but it would be earned. As the days passed, the intensity of engagements around Cuidaquanavale increased. Artillery fire became a constant presence, its deafening roar punctuating the landscape. Both sides dug in, preparing for what would soon become one of the most significant battles of the South African border war. Vermek's squad found themselves under heavy fire one afternoon while securing a supply route. "Take cover," he shouted as shells exploded around them, sending plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. Private Muller scrambled behind a fallen tree, clutching his radio like a lifeline. "We need reinforcements," he called out, his voice shaking but resolute. In the FAPLA camp, Miguel coordinated a counter-barrage with the Cuban artillery units. The precision of their fire disrupted the South African advance, forcing them to retreat to more defensible positions. "Stay focused," Miguel urged his men, his calm leadership inspiring confidence. Nzinga's unit used the chaos to infiltrate deeper into enemy territory. Moving swiftly and silently, they gathered intelligence on troop movements and supply lines. The risk was immense, but Nzinga knew the value of their work. "Every step brings us closer to freedom," he reminded his men, their resolve unwavering. By mid-October, the battlefield had transformed into a sprawling network of trenches, fortified positions, and artillery emplacements. The conflict had reached a stalemate, with neither side willing to concede an inch. The soldiers on the ground bore the brunt of this deadlock, their lives defined by the relentless cycle of attack and defense. Vermic's squad, weary but determined, adapted to the harsh conditions. Nights were spent under the stars, their conversations often turning to home. "Do you think they'll write about us in history books?" Muller asked one evening. Vermic's response was thoughtful. "If they do, I hope they remember the sacrifices we made." For Miguel, the battle had become deeply personal. He spent his days moving between positions, offering words of encouragement to his troops. "This is our land," he told them. "We fight not just for victory but for the generations to come." Nzinga, ever the tactician, devised a daring plan to disrupt FAPLA's supply lines. His unit executed the mission with precision, destroying a convoy of vital supplies. The success bolstered their spirits, a rare moment of triumph in an otherwise grueling campaign. By late October, the South African Defense Forces, SADF, and UNITA increased the intensity of their attacks on Cuidaquanavale. The operation had transformed from an artillery campaign to an all-out struggle for dominance. Both sides poured resources into the battlefield, determined to break the stalemate. Vermic's squad was tasked with leading an advance through a contested sector. The terrain was rugged, marked by dense undergrowth and steep inclines. As they moved cautiously, the distant rumble of artillery grew louder. "Stay sharp," Vermic whispered, his grip on his rifle tightening. At the heart of Cuidaquanavale, Captain Miguel prepared his men for the coming onslaught. Despite the heavy bombardments, morale remained high thanks to the presence of Cuban advisors like Colonel Ramirez. Together, they reinforced key positions, turning the town into a fortress. "We will not let them pass," Ramirez declared, his words stealing the resolve of the defenders. Nzinga and his UNITA comrades advanced alongside SADF units, using the cover of night to infiltrate enemy territory. Their movements were silent and deliberate, a deadly contrast to the chaos of the battlefield. Nzinga's focus was unwavering, his mind set on disrupting FAPLA's defenses from within. The night of November 2, 1986, was one of unrelenting violence. Under the cover of darkness, SADF artillery unleashed a barrage on FAPLA's positions, illuminating the sky with fiery arcs. The cacophony was deafening, a symphony of destruction that reverberated for miles. Vermic's squad found themselves caught in the crossfire as FAPLA artillery retaliated. "Down!" Vermic shouted as shells exploded around them, showering the ground with debris. Private Muller, trembling but determined, clutched his radio and relayed coordinates for counter-fire. Their survival depended on precision and teamwork. Miguel, hunkered down in a bunker, issued orders through the chaos. His men, though battered, responded with remarkable discipline. "Hold your ground," he urged, his voice carrying above the din. The defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew the cost of defeat. Nzinga's unit struck at an enemy supply depot during the chaos, setting fires that lit up the night. As the flames consumed vital resources, Nzinga allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. "This will slow them down," he said to his men, their faces illuminated by the inferno. By November 5th, the balance of power began to shift. While the SADF and UNITA made significant gains, FAPLA's resistance grew fiercer. Cuban reinforcements played a critical role, bringing advanced weaponry and tactical expertise to the battlefield. Vermic's squad managed to capture a strategic hill overlooking Cuidaquanavale, but the cost was high. As they secured the position, Vermek surveyed the battlefield below. Smoke rose from the town, obscuring the horizon. "We're closer," he murmured, though the price of each step weighed heavily on him. Miguel, now coordinating with Colonel Ramirez, launched a series of counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. One such assault targeted the hill Vermek's squad had taken. The battle was fierce, with both sides exchanging relentless fire. Miguel's leadership inspired his men, though the toll on their numbers was undeniable. Nzinga's unit supported the SAD's defense of the hill, engaging FAPLA forces in close combat. The fighting was brutal, each moment a test of endurance and willpower. Nzinga's resolve never wavered, even as the losses mounted. "We hold the line," he told his men, his voice steady despite the chaos. In the midst of the unending violence, moments of calm allowed the soldiers to reflect on the war and its meaning. For some, these pauses were an opportunity to gather strength; for others, they were a reminder of what had been lost. One evening, Vermek's squad gathered around a small fire, sharing stories of home. Private Muller spoke of his younger brother, who dreamed of becoming a pilot. "I promised I'd teach him to fly," Muller said quietly. The squad listened, their silence a testament to the shared weight of their experiences. Miguel found solace in his journal, where he recorded the events of each day. His entries reflected both the horrors of war and the moments of humanity he encountered. "Amidst the fire, there is still hope," he wrote one night, his words a reminder of his unwavering resolve. Nzinga, sitting alone under a star-filled sky, thought of his family. He carried a small photograph of his parents, worn and creased from years of handling. For them, he whispered, his voice carrying a mix of determination and longing. The photograph was a reminder of why he fought and what he hoped to achieve. The story of Operation Red Beam. In the sweltering heart of Central Africa, where the vast wilderness of Zaire stretched endlessly, the city of Kolwezi emerged like a stubborn oasis amidst the tumultuous backdrop of political upheaval. It was May 1978, and the world was watching anxiously as whispers of rebellion grew into a deafening roar. The Shaba II invasion had brought chaos to this mining hub, a city whose veins ran rich with copper and cobalt but whose streets now trembled with the boots of insurgents. The Front for the National Liberation of the Congo, FLNC, fueled by decades of discontent and external support, surged across the borders with precision and fury. Kolwezi fell swiftly into their hands, its once bustling neighborhoods now shadowed by fear. Among the city's trapped population were thousands of European expatriates, engineers, and workers tied to the sprawling mining industry. They were hostages in a deadly political game, pawns in a battle that extended far beyond the dusty borders of Zaire. News of the crisis reached Europe with chilling urgency. The world held its breath as Paris and Brussels debated their response. For the French Foreign Legion and Belgian paratroopers, the mission would be clear but perilous: liberate the city, rescue the hostages, and restore a fragile order. The rebels, well-armed and entrenched, awaited them like predators in the wild. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. Thus began the story of Kolwezi, a tale of heroism, sacrifice, and the unyielding human spirit amid the chaos of war. Over the next 5 days, the city would become the stage for one of the most daring airborne operations in modern history. Kolwezi's importance was not merely geographic, it was economic, a jewel in the crown of Zaire's mining wealth. Beneath its soil lay vast deposits of copper and cobalt, materials critical to the global industrial machine. But wealth bred envy, and its riches drew not only miners but also foreign interests, mercenaries, and eventually rebels. The Shaba region had long been a powder keg. Formerly known as Katanga, it had seen secessionist attempts during the 1960s, quashed only with heavy-handed international intervention. By 1978, the scars of those conflicts had not healed. The FLNC, exiled to neighboring Angola after earlier defeats, re-emerged with a vengeance, bolstered by Cuban military advisors and Soviet-supplied weapons. Their objective was clear: destabilize the Zairian government of Mobutu Sese Seko and reclaim control of Shaba. For Mobutu, the rebellion was a direct threat to his grip on power. His regime, propped up by Western allies who valued stability over democracy, faced growing dissent from within and without. In Kinshasa, Mobutu declared the rebellion an international conspiracy, appealing for help to France and Belgium. His cries for assistance echoed in the corridors of power in Europe, where leaders weighed their options. As FLNC forces crossed into Shaba, their ranks swelled with seasoned fighters eager to strike a blow against the Zairian government. The rebels marched quickly and decisively, capturing Kolwezi and taking control of its airstrip, the lifeline of the city. Civilians, both Zairians and Europeans, became prisoners in their own homes, their fates tied to the whims of a brutal conflict. News of the Kolwezi crisis reached Paris in the early hours of May 13, 1978. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was briefed on the unfolding events. Thousands of Europeans were at the mercy of FLNC rebels. For the French Foreign Legion, an elite force seasoned in the harshest battles, the call was inevitable. Operation Bonite, later known as Operation Leopard, was born. In Belgium, the situation was no less dire. The expatriate community in Kolwezi included hundreds of Belgian citizens. Prime Minister Leo Tindmans convened an emergency council, greenlighting a parallel operation, Red Beam. While France and Belgium prepared their forces, intelligence trickled in. The rebels were entrenched, well-armed, and had fortified positions throughout the city. The French Foreign Legion's 2nd Parachute Regiment, 2 REP, commanded by Colonel Philippe Erlin, was tasked with leading the assault. The plan was audacious: an airborne drop into Kolwezi itself, bypassing rebel lines to secure key positions and rescue hostages. Every detail was scrutinized, every possibility accounted for. Yet no plan could fully anticipate the chaos of combat. As troops boarded aircraft at bases in France and Belgium, a sense of resolve gripped the soldiers. For many, this mission was not just about duty, it was about proving the value of their training, their brotherhood, and their courage. The skies over Kolwezi awaited, and so too did history. The French C-160 Transall planes roared to life on May 18, 1978, their engines a deafening prelude to the mission ahead. Inside, the paratroopers of the 2nd Parachute Regiment sat in silence, their gear packed tightly around them. Each soldier carried an M16 rifle, grenades, and the weight of uncertainty. Kolwezi was a distant dot on the map, shrouded in the fog of war. Colonel Philippe Erlin's orders were clear: drop directly into Kolwezi, seize the strategic points, and liberate the hostages. But intelligence was scant. The number of rebels, their positions, and the condition of the hostages were unknown. The paratroopers would be landing blind into a city swarming with enemies. In the skies over Zaire, tension was palpable. Below, the terrain transformed from lush jungle to the rugged outskirts of Kolwezi. As the green light flashed in the aircraft, the men stood, checked their parachutes, and shuffled to the open doors. The moment of truth had arrived. One by one, the paratroopers leaped into the night sky, their silhouettes swallowed by the darkness. The descent was chaotic, with strong winds scattering the troops across the drop zones. As they landed, the sounds of Kolwezi greeted them: gunfire, distant explosions, and the cries of a city under siege. The battle had begun. The initial hours after the drop were a frenzy of movement and gunfire. Scattered across the city, French paratroopers regrouped as best they could. Communication was limited, and each soldier relied on training and instinct to navigate Kolwezie's maze of narrow streets and crumbling buildings. The rebels, caught off guard by the sudden airborne assault, responded with sporadic resistance. From hidden positions, they unleashed bursts of gunfire, forcing the paratroopers to move cautiously. Each building was a potential stronghold, each street corner a deadly trap. Despite the chaos, the paratroopers managed to secure key positions. The first hostages, European families who had been hiding in basements, were located and evacuated under heavy guard. Their stories painted a grim picture: executions, looting, and indiscriminate violence by the rebels. Meanwhile, the Belgian forces began their own operation, securing the airstrip and preparing for the extraction of civilians. The cooperation between French and Belgian troops was crucial, a seamless coordination that reflected their shared urgency. As more hostages were found, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Kolwezi was a city on the brink of collapse, and the paratroopers were its only hope. The sun rose over Kolwezi on May 19, revealing a city transformed into a battlefield. Smoke billowed from burning buildings, and the sound of sporadic gunfire echoed through the empty streets. The French paratroopers moved methodically, clearing one sector at a time. Every doorway could conceal an ambush, every rooftop a sniper. Lieutenant Michel Renaud led a small unit tasked with securing the eastern sector of the city. They encountered a barricade hastily erected by the rebels, an assortment of overturned vehicles and debris. The paratroopers launched a quick assault, using flashbangs to disorient the defenders before neutralizing them. Behind the barricade, they discovered a group of terrified hostages, including women and children, huddled in a small, dark room. Relief mixed with fury as the soldiers saw the conditions in which these people had been kept. Elsewhere, Colonel Philippe Erelin coordinated his forces with precision, maintaining momentum despite the challenges of urban warfare. The rebels, though initially disorganized, began mounting a more determined defense. Gunfire rained from hidden positions as the FLNC used their knowledge of the city to their advantage. But the French troops pressed forward, their discipline and superior training giving them the edge. By midday, the paratroopers had secured several key positions, including the main hospital and parts of the residential areas. With each block reclaimed, more hostages were freed, their stories of survival driving the soldiers onward. The battle for Kolwezi was far from over, but the tide was turning. While the French forces fought fiercely in Kolwezi, Belgian paratroopers, part of the Red Bean operation, prepared to join the fight. Their mission was twofold: assist in securing the city and ensure the safety of Belgian nationals among the hostages. Landing at the Kolwezi airstrip under cover of darkness, the Belgian troops faced their own challenges. The rebels had mined the approach to the airfield, and clearing these obstacles delayed their advance. By the time they reached the city, the fighting was already in full swing. Captain Peter van der Meer, leading a Belgian unit, worked closely with the French to secure the western side of Kolwezi. His troops encountered fierce resistance, with rebels using machine guns and RPGs to hold their positions. A particularly intense firefight broke out near a local school, where several hostages were being held. The Belgians fought their way in, freeing dozens of captives while sustaining several injuries. The cooperation between the French and Belgian forces became a hallmark of the operation. Despite differences in language and command structures, the soldiers worked seamlessly to achieve their shared goal. By the end of the day, the western sector of Kolwezi was firmly under coalition control, but the battle was far from over. As the coalition forces tightened their grip on Kolwezi, the FLNC rebels regrouped. Determined to retain control of the city, they launched a counteroffensive on May 20th. The rebels targeted key positions held by the French and Belgians, hoping to sow confusion and regain the upper hand. One of the fiercest engagements occurred near Kolwezi's central market. French paratroopers, entrenched in a defensive position, came under heavy fire from multiple directions. The rebels, armed with Soviet-made AK-47s and mortars, pushed the paratroopers to their limits. For hours, the soldiers held their ground, repelling wave after wave of attackers. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the coalition forces used superior tactics and firepower to withstand the assault. Helicopter gunships provided crucial air support, strafing rebel positions and breaking their momentum. By nightfall, the counteroffensive had been repelled, leaving the rebels scattered and weakened. The victory came at a cost. Several paratroopers were wounded, and the toll of the battle weighed heavily on the troops. But with the rebels in retreat, the coalition forces seized the opportunity to push forward, determined to end the conflict once and for all. The coalition forces were relentless. As dawn broke on May 21st, the French and Belgian troops launched a coordinated sweep through Kolwezi's northern and southern sectors, determined to clear the remaining pockets of resistance. The once bustling city now resembled a war zone, its streets littered with debris, bullet casings, and the scars of battle. Lieutenant Jean Morel's squad advanced cautiously through the northern district, encountering stiff resistance near a factory complex. The rebels had fortified the area, using sandbags and overturned machinery for cover. A fierce firefight ensued, with the paratroopers inching forward under heavy fire. Using smoke grenades to obscure their movements, they eventually overran the position, capturing several rebels and securing the factory. Simultaneously, Captain Peter van der Meer led his Belgian troops through the southern outskirts. They discovered a rebel hideout in a cluster of abandoned warehouses, where they found weapons caches and evidence of looted goods. Among the captives was a rebel commander, whose capture dealt a severe blow to the FLNC's morale. By midday, the coalition forces had effectively encircled the remaining rebels. The once coordinated resistance now devolved into disorganized skirmishes. The soldiers pressed their advantage, their resolve unshaken despite exhaustion and the emotional toll of the operation. On the morning of May 22, Kolwezi was finally declared secure. The coalition forces had reclaimed the city after 5 days of intense combat. For the hostages, it was a moment of relief and disbelief. Families reunited amidst tears and embraces as soldiers escorted them to the airstrip for evacuation. One of the most poignant scenes unfolded at the local school, where over 100 children and teachers were found alive. The rebels had abandoned the building during their retreat, leaving the terrified hostages behind. French paratroopers arrived to find the group huddled in silence, their expressions a mixture of fear and hope. As the soldiers reassured them, a wave of gratitude and emotion swept through the room. The evacuation was a monumental effort. Belgian aircraft ferried hundreds of hostages to safety, while French troops remained on the ground to ensure the city's stability. Despite the overwhelming success of the mission, the cost of liberation was evident. Buildings lay in ruins, lives had been lost, and Kolwezi bore the scars of a brutal conflict. For Colonel Philippe Erlin and his troops, the mission's conclusion brought a sense of accomplishment tempered by solemn reflection. The hostages were safe, but the memories of the battle would remain with them forever. As the hostages were evacuated and the soldiers regrouped, the political ramifications of the operation began to unfold. The success of the coalition forces highlighted the strategic value of European intervention in Africa, but it also raised questions about the balance of power in the region. In Zaire, President Mobutu Sese Seko celebrated the victory, portraying it as a triumph for his regime. Yet, the rebellion had exposed the fragility of his government and the volatility of the Shaba region. Internationally, the operation reinforced the reputation of the French Foreign Legion as a formidable military force, while Belgium's role underscored its commitment to protecting its nationals abroad. For the people of Kolwezi, rebuilding was slow and painful. The scars of the conflict were etched into the city's fabric, a reminder of the price of its liberation. Survivors shared harrowing stories of their ordeal, ensuring that the memory of the Battle of Kolwezi would not fade. As the troops prepared to depart, a sense of camaraderie lingered among the French and Belgian forces. Their shared mission had forged bonds that transcended borders and languages. Though the battle was over, the story of Kolwezi would endure, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. As the coalition forces tightened their hold on Kolwezi, the FLNC rebels scattered into the surrounding countryside. The once organized insurgents now moved in small, disbanded groups, their morale shattered by the swift and decisive actions of the French and Belgian forces. Among the rebels was Nathaniel Mbumba, the FLNC leader. Facing capture, he ordered his remaining forces to retreat across the border into Angola. The journey was harrowing, with constant aerial surveillance by coalition forces and sporadic ambushes by Zairian military patrols. For many rebels, the dream of a victorious uprising had turned into a desperate fight for survival. Back in Kolwezi, the coalition command deliberated whether to pursue the rebels further or consolidate their victory in the city. Colonel Philippe Erlin, ever pragmatic, advocated focusing on securing Kolwezi and ensuring the safety of its population. His decision marked the end of direct combat operations, though the conflict's shadow would linger. The rebels' retreat left behind a shattered insurgency. Their failure in Kolwezi would weaken their cause, but it would not extinguish it. The seeds of rebellion had been scattered, and the Shaba region remained a tinderbox of political tension. For the soldiers who fought in Kolwezi, the end of the battle brought a flood of emotions. Pride in their success was tempered by the memories of fallen comrades and the haunting scenes of the battlefield. Corporal Alain Dubois of the French Foreign Legion, who had been part of the first wave, reflected on the resilience of the hostages. "They endured horrors we can barely imagine," he said, recalling the moment he freed a family that had spent days hiding in a cramped cellar. For Dubois and many others, the mission was not just about victory but about humanity. Belgian paratrooper Jan de Wild, a young recruit on his first mission, spoke of the camaraderie forged during the operation. "We came here as strangers, but we leave as brothers," he remarked, gesturing toward his French counterparts. The shared struggle had created bonds that transcended national borders, uniting the troops in their shared purpose. Despite their successes, many soldiers wrestled with the moral complexities of war. They had seen firsthand the cost of conflict, not just in lives lost but in the toll it took on a city and its people. Kolwezi had been liberated, but its scars would take much longer to heal. As the hostages evacuated from Kolwezi reached safety in Europe, their stories began to emerge. Each account added a piece to the mosaic of the city's suffering and resilience. Elizabeth Jansen, a Belgian schoolteacher, described the harrowing days she spent hiding in a storage room with her students. "We heard gunfire all around us," she said. "Every time it grew closer, I thought it would be the end." Her voice trembled as she recounted the moment the Belgian troops burst through the door, their uniforms a beacon of hope in the darkness. Henri Leclerc, a French mining engineer, recounted how he and his colleagues had been forced to work under guard by the rebels. They told us we were bargaining chips, he explained. But deep down, I knew the soldiers would come. And they did. The hostages' voices painted a vivid picture of resilience and gratitude. Their testimonies also highlighted the courage of the coalition forces and the importance of the operation. Kolwezie's liberation was not just a military victory but a testament to the power of human determination in the face of adversity. As the smoke of battle cleared, the city of Kolwezi began its painful journey toward normalcy. Streets once bustling with life were now eerily quiet, lined with rubble and abandoned vehicles. Buildings bore the scars of gunfire, and the air was heavy with the scent of destruction. Local residents emerged cautiously from their hiding places, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. For many, the end of the battle was just the beginning of their struggles. Shops had been looted, homes destroyed, and families torn apart. The emotional wounds ran as deep as the physical ones. In the days following the battle, the Zairian military moved into the city to restore order. Their presence was met with mixed emotions. For some, they were a symbol of stability; for others, they were a reminder of the systemic failures that had allowed the rebellion to take root. Still, the people of Kolwezi clung to the hope that the worst was behind them. Rebuilding efforts began almost immediately. International aid organizations arrived to provide food, medical care, and support for displaced families. Engineers worked to repair the city's infrastructure, while psychologists and social workers tended to the survivors' mental scars. Though the road ahead was long, the resilience of Kolwezi's people shone brightly. The FLNC's defeat in Kolwezi marked a turning point for the group. Their retreat into Angola had left them fragmented and demoralized. The loss of their stronghold in Kolwezi undermined their credibility, both within their ranks and among their international backers. Nathaniel Mbumba, the rebel leader, faced increasing dissent from his commanders. Many blamed him for underestimating the coalition forces and leading them into a disastrous confrontation. Tensions within the group escalated, with some factions breaking away to pursue their own agendas. Despite their setbacks, the FLNC remained a threat. Their network of supporters and their ability to exploit the grievances of the Shaba region ensured that they would not disappear entirely. For Zaire's government, the victory in Kolwezi was a temporary reprieve, not a final resolution. In Angola, the FLNC began regrouping, preparing for future operations. Their leaders vowed to continue the fight, but their morale was at an all-time low. The shadow of Kolwezi loomed large over their ranks, a stark reminder of the power of coordinated international intervention. The Battle of Kolwezi reverberated far beyond the borders of Zaire. In France and Belgium, the operation was hailed as a triumph of military precision and humanitarian intervention. Newspapers splashed images of victorious soldiers and rescued hostages across their front pages, praising the swift and decisive actions of their governments. However, not all reactions were positive. Some critics questioned the ethics of military intervention, arguing that it perpetuated neo-colonial dynamics in Africa. Others pointed to the underlying issues of Mobutu's regime, suggesting that international support only propped up a dictator rather than addressing the root causes of rebellion. In the broader geopolitical context, the operation demonstrated the growing influence of Cold War politics in Africa. Western nations framed their involvement as a bulwark against communist expansion, citing the FLNC's ties to Cuba and the Soviet Union. This narrative played well in Washington and NATO capitals but deepened tensions with the Eastern Bloc. For Zaire, the aftermath of Kolwezi was a complex mix of gratitude and unease. While Mobutu's government welcomed the support, it also faced renewed scrutiny from its citizens and the international community. The victory in Kolwezi had come at a high cost, and the country's challenges were far from over.